Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a world where honor clinks like a blade on polished wood, where shadows stretch long over paper walls, and where even desire is dressed in silk, regulated, and signed in triplicate. You're lying beneath a warm blanket, maybe with a fan humming in the background, and the idea of a samurai stoic, armored, slicing through enemies without blinking, feels distant, sharp, and cold. But let's bring him closer. Imagine you are that samurai. It's midnight. You're standing barefoot on polished tatami. A candle flickers in the corner, your armor's off. Your body is sore from hours of sword drills. Someone's waiting behind a rice paper screen. But before you step forward, before your lips brush skin or your hand finds warmth, you must wait. Not for a look or a nod, but for permission. In writing, stamped, sealed, approved. Welcome to the peculiar, almost bureaucratic world of samurai. Sex. You probably won't survive this, not because of the violence, but because the rules are so tangled, they could strangle your libido. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening somewhere unusual, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing which corners of the world we're drifting off together from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start your day before dawn. Roosters crow over distant rice fields. The cold air bites. You're dressed by servants. Your swords are polished. And already, somewhere in the back of your mind, is the knowledge that your sex life is not your own. You're a retainer in the service of a daimyo, a warlord with eyebrows, bushy enough to terrify small birds, and a paper trail longer than your katana. In theory, you're allowed a wife. In practice, every intimate act must be cleared. That's not just cultural, it's strategic. Sex, in this rigid society, isn't pleasure. It's paperwork, power, and protocol. You need permission to marry. You need permission to sleep with your spouse. You need permission to have a concubine, and then approval to visit her. And even then, that permission can be rescinded if you act dishonorably, like being late to a tea ceremony, or laughing too loud, or sneezing at your lord's poetry reading. The code of bushidō, the way of the warrior, isn't just about fighting with honor. It's about living, eating, dying, and yes, loving with a code of conduct so strict, it makes Catholic school seem like Burning Man. Historians still argue whether this sexual micromanagement was truly enforced or more of an idealized threat, a tool of control dressed in silk. But scrolls remain, official documents, letters between samurai and their lords, where requests for bedroom privileges sit right next to grain reports and complaints about horse feed. And here's where it gets oddly beautiful. These requests were often poetic. One 17th century samurai wrote to his superior asking for a night with his concubine, describing her scent as rice steamed beneath plum blossoms. It was granted with a warning: let not desire make your sword hand clumsy, which is possibly the most passive-aggressive threat in recorded history. Sex, you realize, isn't just a private act. It's part of your military discipline. Too much of it, weakness. Too little, suspicion. And while you're supposed to channel desire into loyalty and swordsmanship, you're also expected to father heirs to ensure a legacy, a bloodline. But not just any heirs. You need approved, legitimate, logistically justified children. One lord reportedly revoked a samurai's sexual rights for having too many daughters. He was told to focus his will more sharply, as if he were aiming his sperm like arrows. And it's not just about wives and mistresses. It's about hierarchy. If your lord wants your wife, he may ask. You can't say no. Or rather, you can. But your head may roll into a koi pond. Eleanor Herman, in Sex with Kings, recounts parallel systems in royal Europe where nobles offered up wives and daughters as part of courtly loyalty. Japan, while culturally distinct, followed its own version. Certain daimyo expected their samurai to gift companionship for an evening, sometimes as a sign of trust, sometimes as punishment. There are stories of warriors returning from battle only to find their wives occupied by their own lord, sipping tea like nothing was amiss. And yet, paradoxically, the samurai's world is full of tenderness. A letter from a young warrior in 1610 describes how he spent a single night with his wife before going off to war. He writes, "Her hair smelled of pine, and I feared I would never again sleep without that forest." It's moments like this that pierce through the bureaucracy and remind you these were real people, bound by absurd expectations, aching for warmth. Still, the rules persisted. The bedroom was an extension of the battlefield. One mistake, and it could cost you everything. There's also a kind of romantic fatalism in the air. You live knowing that desire must be managed like a sword, always sheathed when not in use, sharpened when called upon. Erotic restraint was seen as noble. Some samurai refused all intimacy before campaigns, believing celibacy increased strength. Others engaged in rituals to cleanse themselves after intercourse, often involving salt, incense, and meditation. Again, historians debate whether these rituals were widespread or symbolic, but they left behind a paper trail of smudged ink, dried blossoms, and the ghostly scent of duty overriding desire. And then, of course, there's the gossip. The kitchen staff knew who was permitted what. Servants passed rumors in folded napkins. Some lords kept detailed logs of who had permission, when, and whether they seemed appropriately humble about it. One warrior was reportedly punished not for the act itself, but because he wore red silk to bed, a color reserved for ceremonies. That's right. He committed textile treason. So here you are. Again, back on your tatami mat. You've trained all day. Your hands are blistered. You're 17. You're married, but haven't yet been granted full conjugal rights. You lie down beside your wife, separated by a thin screen, and the air is thick with incense. She coughs softly. Maybe it's an invitation. Maybe it's just a cough. You don't know. You wait. A knock at the door. A scroll is slipped through. It's from the steward. You've been approved for the next 2 hours. You nod to no one. The candle flickers. You rise. You don't make a sound as you step across the tatami, your feet barely brushing the surface. The scroll rests on a lacquered tray like an offering. You unroll it with the same reverence you'd give a battle order. Approval has come, but not just for pleasure. It's permission for continuation, for legacy, for balance, for status. You feel a strange mix of anticipation and dread, as if the weight of intimacy carries the same gravity as a duel. And it does. In this world, sex is not a private act. It's performance, duty, and above all, rank. Because while you may love, you may not love freely. Every touch is political. Every moan, if it escapes at all, is muffled by protocol. You push aside the paper screen and meet her eyes. She's already kneeling, hands folded, spine straight, not with fear, but formality. This is not the first time she's waited with no idea if the scroll would arrive. You bow. She bows. There are layers between you, still fabric, expectation, silence. You remove your outer robe. She pours tea. The dance begins, and that's just within the bonds of marriage. Outside those walls, things become even more delicately absurd. Consider this. A concubine's status in a samurai household was often as much about documentation as desire. You couldn't just take a lover. She had to be approved, registered, and visited according to a schedule that was usually managed by the estate. Steward, often a gray-haired eunuch with a love for ink and exactitude. If you dared visit her on an unscheduled day, or heaven forbid twice in 1 week, disciplinary action could follow. You might lose rice rations, or worse, be transferred to a less prestigious garrison. One story, whispered in the back rooms of Edo, tells of a samurai who became too enamored with a dancer from the floating world. He skipped 3 archery practices. His commander responded not with scolding, but with strategy. He reassigned the man to a coastal post where the only company was seagulls and salted fish. The message was clear: discipline first, desire a distant second. But it wasn't always bleak. There's charm in the formality, beauty in the structure. Sex, for the samurai, wasn't just biological, it was aesthetic. The robes were chosen with care. Scented sachets were hidden in sleeves. One samurai wrote in his diary that he and his concubine exchanged verses of poetry for 5 nights before touching hands. Better to stir the ink, he wrote, before the brush meets parchment. That line ended up in a popular haiku collection, and scholars still debate whether he meant the poetry or something far more risk. And here's a strange but delightful tidbit. Some families employed intimacy coaches. Not in the modern sex therapist sense, but older women, usually widows who had once served the household. They taught young brides how to bow properly. In the bedroom, how to respond with just the right amount of hesitation. How to fold the bedding so that it suggested openness without presumption. One manual advised, a woman should lie like snow on pine still, silent, and able to melt. Meanwhile, male samurai were not immune to instruction either. They were taught not only how to wield swords, but how to enter a room with erotic modesty. Your arrival should be like mist, one training text explained. Your presence felt, not forced. Of course, this all sounds romantic, but there's an underlying anxiety in it too. Everything is encoded. Everything can be misread. A misplaced laugh, an overly eager step, a robe too hastily undone, any of it could be reported and misinterpreted as arrogance or impropriety. This is where the real tension lies. Not in the sex itself, but in the choreography of it. You spend so much time preparing, anticipating, wondering if tonight is the night. And when it is, you wonder if you'll do it wrong. If you'll enjoy it too much, or not enough. If your performance will be judged, not by your lover, but by your superiors, your peers, your future sons reading your journals. Which brings us to the strangest twist of all. Sex reports. Yes, some samurai were expected to submit written summaries of their intimate encounters. Not in crude detail, but in terms of harmony, spiritual alignment, and emotional impact. One such report survives from the early Edo period. A young retainer wrote, "The union was like wind on still water. No ripple, no storm." His superior noted, "Adequate. Continue discipline." Imagine receiving a performance review for your bedroom efforts, scored like a tea ceremony. But it's not all cold formality. There's genuine vulnerability here too. A sense that love, even lust, had to squeeze itself into tight corners just to survive. Some warriors kept tiny keepsakes, strands of hair, pieces of kimono hidden in scroll cases alongside battle maps. These objects were never spoken of. Some were burned before death to avoid dishonoring reputations. Others were buried with their owners, tied into tiny knots as if they were secrets folded in on themselves. And here's where it gets even more intimate. In the samurai world, even dreams were monitored. One lord reportedly kept a dream journal for his retainers, asking them to record not only their military visions, but also romantic or erotic ones. The idea was to track patterns, divine omens, detect loyalties. Imagine being summoned to a dawn meeting and asked to explain why you dreamed of kissing a woman from a rival clan. She smelled of cedar and betrayal, you might say. Historians still argue whether these dream records were serious spiritual tools or just another layer of control, but they existed. Then there's the matter of consent. Not in the modern sense, but in the coded systems of invitation and response. A dropped comb could signal willingness. A slightly open door at dusk meant an invitation. A scarf tied wrong could mean, "not tonight." One scholar described these Signs as erotic semaphore, a language of silk, scent, and silence. You had to know the rules. If you misread them, you could offend. Or worse, overstep. One famous scandal in Kyoto involved a samurai who misunderstood a hairpin gesture and kissed a noblewoman he wasn't supposed to. He was publicly demoted, not for the kiss, but for poor interpretive skills. You start to feel it now, don't you? That odd, weighty intimacy. That sense that everything is scripted, watched, scored, but somehow still deeply, tragically human. These men weren't robots. They longed, they wrote poetry, they folded sleeves with trembling fingers. They were just as confused as you are when standing in front of someone beautiful, hoping to be seen and fearing what happens next. In their world, even pleasure was a form of service. And sometimes, in stolen moments behind sliding doors, they remembered what it was to be simply two people, not samurai and wife, not retainer and mistress, but breath and heartbeat and silence shared under the flicker of a single fragile flame. By now, you've learned that the blade wasn't the only thing a samurai had to sheath with care. Desire itself had to be honed, polished, and controlled like a katana, kept sharp, but hidden. And nowhere was that more vividly on display than in the quiet, calculated sexual hierarchy that governed the world of the daimyo, the feudal lords who ruled provinces like miniature empires. You, dear listener, may be a skilled swordsman, fiercely loyal, and properly trained in the 1,000 forms of bowing. But that doesn't mean you have sexual autonomy, not even close. Your body belongs, in the most pragmatic sense, to the man you serve. And so does your bedroom life. The daimyo controlled access to land, food, marriage, and pleasure. They determined who could wed and when, who could claim a concubine, and whose lineage was worthy of continuing. They approved your wife, monitored your bedroom schedule, and could revoke all of it with a single brushstroke across a scroll. In many cases, sex was granted in rations, permission for a night here, a holiday there. Sometimes, intimacy became a reward, meted out after a battle, a flawless poem, or a particularly well-served tea ceremony. Other times, it was withheld as punishment. Not overtly, of course, that would be gauche. No, your superior would simply forget to process your petition. The scroll would remain unsigned. Your wife would remain untouched. And no one would say a word. In this world, power is deeply erotic, not in the overt sense of dominance and submission, but in the subtle way a daimyo might decide who gets to love and who must abstain. Imagine being told you must wait 6 months before consummating a marriage because your superior believes desire clouds the sword. Or worse, being ordered to sire a child not with your wife, but with a distant cousin chosen for her political alliance. You comply, of course, because refusal isn't an option. And here comes one of those strange, true stories. In the late 1500s, a mid-ranking samurai named Ishikawa was granted the rare honor of marrying into a prestigious family. However, his lord was concerned that the couple's child might be born under an unlucky zodiac. So instead of allowing them to sleep together immediately, he ordered them to cohabitate, but refrain from intimacy for an entire year. During that time, they wrote poetry to each other from opposite sides of a shared screen. Their child, born 2 years later, was considered strategically conceived, and Ishikawa was promoted. This sounds ridiculous, because it is, but it also reveals how seriously reproduction and intimacy were interwoven with feudal governance. Your love life isn't yours. It's an extension of your loyalty, a demonstration of your self-control. And if you can't demonstrate that, you're considered unfit for higher service. That's not speculation, it's written in records. Some daimyo kept intimacy logs, monitoring which of their retainers were able to maintain composure during their scheduled visits with their wives or mistresses. A poor report could delay a promotion. And here's where things get truly absurd. Certain households reportedly used temple scribes to witness these encounters, not inside the room, of course, but outside, listening for signs of harmony. Too much noise? Reprimand? Too little? Suspicion. Historians still argue whether these scribes were real or mythical cautionary figures meant to keep young retainers in line. Either way, the anxiety was real. Then there's the matter of lineage. In the samurai class, producing a son wasn't just a biological goal, it was a political requirement. But unlike in many Western monarchies, where royal bastards could complicate succession, in feudal Japan, illegitimate sons were sometimes useful. So long as they were declared and acknowledged properly, they could be raised as military assets, educated alongside legitimate heirs, and sent into service as needed. But and this is important, only if the mother was approved. A child born from an unauthorized union, even if strong and brilliant, could be discarded. There's a case from 1647 where a promising young samurai was stripped of his family name after it was revealed his mother had not been properly registered as a concubine. He was renamed, reclassified as a servant, and never again allowed to carry a sword. His story ends in quiet shame, documented in the margins of an estate inventory, deemed excessive in origin. So imagine the pressure. You're expected to perform sexually, but within precise, often shifting boundaries. Your seed must land in the right womb, under the right phase of the moon, with the correct authorization. And yet, when it succeeds, when the scrolls are signed, when the child is born under an auspicious star, your entire standing can change overnight. One well-timed child could elevate your status. A daughter might bring political alliance. A son might inherit your land, or be taken by your lord and raised at court, stripped from your home but honored in name. It's not just the men navigating this labyrinth. The women wives, concubines, noble daughters, were often caught in the crossfire of these sexual hierarchies. Their bodies, too, were assets to be arranged, negotiated, protected, or sacrificed. A woman might be married off at 15, expected to charm, conceive, and remain demure without ever having spoken to her husband before the wedding. Others were trained specifically as political concubines, educated not only in tea ceremony and poetry, but also in the art of silent persuasion. One woman, known only as Lady Hataru, was famed for her ability to influence her daimyo lover's military decisions through subtle conversation during pillow talk. She is said to have turned 2 invasions into diplomatic treaties with nothing more than strategic moaning and metaphor-laced verse. Yet even she, like all women in this world, was ranked. Wives had precedence, official concubines were next. After that came favored servants, entertainers, and rarely outsiders brought into the household through alliances or war. Their roles were defined not just by affection or desire, but by how their sexual access impacted the household's reputation. A single rumor could demote a woman from second mistress to dishonored exile, and if pregnancy occurred without permission, the punishment could be severe. Not necessarily execution, though that wasn't unheard of, but banishment, silence, erasure from the family registry. Her child labeled unclaimed, her name scratched from scrolls. Even now, historians debate how widespread these punishments were, but the fear was omnipresent, whispered, folded into bedtime warnings and bridal instructions. So you, listening now, cozy and warm, imagine yourself in those layered robes again. You stand in the corridor, scroll in hand, aware that someone is watching, not always directly, but through the walls of protocol. Your love is real, your desire sincere. But sincerity isn't enough. You need strategy, timing, discretion. You need to know who else requested access that week. Whether your wife is in favor, whether your concubine offended someone at the Plum Blossom Festival, whether the moon is too low, whether you bowed correctly at dinner, whether the ink on your scroll matches the household standard. This is the erotic bureaucracy of feudal Japan. It is not passionate, but it is deeply felt. Not romantic, but strangely tender. And always dash, watch. You are dreaming. Not the kind of dream with floating castles or forgotten exams, but one anchored in incense smoke and whispered poetry. You're kneeling in a silk robe, the air heavy with sandalwood and anticipation. A screen slides open behind you, and a voice not loud, but unmistakable, utters your name like it's both invitation and warning. It is not your lover, it is your Lord's messenger. You blink yourself awake to the reality of being summoned. Not to battle, but to answer for a bureaucratic scandal of the heart. The charge: unauthorized intimacy. You touch someone without paperwork. You breath too close to beauty without the appropriate clearance. And now, there are consequences. Welcome to the reality of the shogunate, where sex isn't just managed, it's militarized. There's something strangely cinematic about it. You're a weapon of war, a master of death, and yet you need formal permission to express love. Or lust, or even mild affection. And it gets weirder. Let's talk about the scrolls. Not the ones covered in blood and war maps, but the ones inked in subtle calligraphy, describing bedroom intentions. That's right. If you wanted to engage in intimacy with your spouse or concubine, you often had to file a written request. These weren't groveling love notes. They were official documents submitted to the estate steward, who tracked sexual access alongside rice inventory and sword maintenance. One such scroll from the late Edo period survives in a private collection. It reads, "Request for union with house partner this third night following moon fullness, in accordance with auspicious calendar readings and prior abstention." It's signed, stamped, and approved by a man who probably hadn't had a date since the last eclipse. The implication is clear. Desire must be scheduled, documented, and observed. It must not disrupt household harmony. It must not interfere with loyalty to the daimyo. And it must certainly not be spontaneous. This creates an odd psychological tension. You find yourself waiting, not with giddy excitement, but with militarized patience. You're not just hoping for romance, you're watching the calendar, praying for scrolls, and strategizing around your sword practice. And if you think this only applied to married couples, think again. Samurai had rules for everything, including extramarital encounters. A man caught visiting a courtesan outside of his permitted window might find himself reassigned to border patrol duty, where the only companionship came in the form of ghost stories and the occasional monkey. Even in the pleasure quarters of cities like Edo and Kyoto, warriors were expected to behave with decorum. Enter quietly. No drinking to excess. No lingering beyond your appointment. A samurai could be punished not for visiting a brothel, but for appearing too enthusiastic about it. And this brings us to one of the most bizarre and delicate arrangements in samurai culture, the ritual of bushidō. Literally, the way of the youth. This was a formalized, often institutionalized, mentoring relationship between adult warriors and adolescent boys. Think of it as a cultural mashup of mentorship, emotional intimacy, and sanctioned, age-structured affection. These relationships were layered, codified, and yes, often physical, but within strict rules. Older warriors took on protégés, sometimes as young as 13, training them in swordsmanship, ethics, poetry, and service. In return, the youth pledged loyalty, admiration, and in some cases, their affection. To modern eyes, it's confusing, equal. Parts platonic and painfully unequal, but at the time, it was seen as a way of passing on not just skill, but soul. Samurai diaries speak of bonding under the pine moon, a phrase historians still debate. Was it metaphor for training? Or something more intimate? One such relationship, recorded in the personal scrolls of a Kyoto retainer named Masanobu, describes how his young apprentice brought him tea every morning, bowed 3 times, and recited a verse before breakfast. On winter nights, they reportedly slept under the same quilted futon, though Masanobu was careful never to describe what happened after the lights dimmed. "He stirred like cherry blossoms in spring," he wrote cryptically. That's either a poetic reference to snoring or something blushworthy. Scholars can't agree. But here's the twist. These relationships were not considered shameful. In fact, they were encouraged so long as they upheld honor, discretion, and hierarchy. If a warrior abused his power or humiliated the youth, he faced censure. If he was too indulgent, weakness. If he ignored the youth entirely, dereliction of duty. You had to strike a balance between affection and instruction, warmth and distance. You had to be a swordmaster and a father figure, and occasionally, a restrained romantic. No pressure. And like all things in the samurai world, it was seasonal. By the time the youth reached maturity, the relationship was expected to shift either into distant camaraderie or strategic separation. There are letters from older samurai writing farewell notes to their former companions, often laced with metaphors so thick you could spread them on rice cakes. Like the plum tree releases its blossoms to wind, I release you to the world, one such letter reads. Another simply says, I remember the scent of your sleeves more than the clash of steel. That one? Yeah, probably more than just sword. Drills, but don't think this was all romanticized. Beneath the poetry was a system designed to reinforce loyalty. If you bonded closely with someone you trained and mentored, they were less likely to betray you on the battlefield. If they trusted you with their body, they'd trust you with their life. The logic is chilling, but it worked. Historians still argue whether bushidō was widespread or elite, symbolic or literal, but the impact remains. It shaped how samurai understood intimacy, not as something spontaneous or rebellious, but as structured, layered, and always under observation. And here's a fringe detail you probably didn't see coming. There were actually manuals for this. Not just martial arts scrolls, but philosophical treatises on how to manage emotional closeness without jeopardizing discipline. One fragment from the 1600s reads, "Let affection be like tea, warm, never boiling, spill none. Speak less." That was their motto. It applied to wives, concubines, apprentices, even pets in some cases. There are records of samurai composing mourning poems for lost falcons with more erotic intensity than they showed their spouses. He circled me faithfully until death. No companion soared so close. That's a real line, and no, you're not imagining the innuendo. All of this paints a picture that's both stifling and strangely tender. Intimacy in samurai culture wasn't denied, it was directed, controlled, filtered through scrolls, rituals, poetry, and performance. You didn't just fall into someone's arms. You approached them with ceremony, with metaphor, with an awareness that even love could be weighed like rice or ink. And that awareness never left you. Even in private, with the door shut, the candle low, and your lover's breath against your neck, you carried the ghost of regulation. You made love like you practiced sword forms, precisely, purposefully, with each movement measured and remembered. And so, tonight, you rest again on that tatami mat, scroll delivered, duties fulfilled. Your hand reaches across the bedding, not with hunger, but with reverence. Your partner turns toward you, eyes lowered, not from fear, but from custom. A candle flickers, casting shadows like ripples across a pond. Outside, a pine branch scratches against the paper wall, and in that moment, you realize this. Passion isn't dead in this world. It's just disguised in etiquette, in permission slips, in folded sleeves and metaphor. And somehow, despite it all, it burns just as hot. A candle melts slowly in the corner of the room, pooling wax like forgotten time. You're reclining. Now your body's still humming with the weight of rituals performed. But just as sleep begins to edge its way into your bones, There's a knock, 3 soft raps, too polite to be urgent, but too deliberate to ignore. You know that knock. It's the steward. Again, you rise, adjust your robe, and slide open the screen to find him bowing, scroll in hand. You haven't broken a rule, at least you don't think you have. But in this world, the line between propriety and punishment is thinner than rice paper. The steward doesn't speak. He just hands you the scroll, bows again, and vanishes like steam off a hot bowl of soba. You sit, you open it, and you read the one phrase that makes your stomach clench tighter than your armor's obi sash. Permission temporarily revoked. This was not uncommon. Permission to engage in intimacy could be and often was rescinded at any time. Not due to moral failing or scandal, but because of politics. If your lord suspected unrest, even in distant provinces, he might revoke bedroom privileges to keep his men focused. If rice production dipped, permissions delayed. If a senior retainer died, mourning periods imposed, affection embargoed. One 17th century report even lists suspicion of excessive pleasure as a reason for sexual suspension. The accused samurai had written haiku that, according to the court scribes, sounded distracted by flesh. That's right. Erotic poetry was being used as evidence of political unreliability. This wasn't about sin. It was about suspicion. And so you adapt. You become fluid in euphemism. You don't say you want to see your wife. You say the moon tonight is generous. You don't say you miss her touch. You say your ink dries too fast these days. If you're clever, the right words in the right ear might earn you a special exemption. But be too direct, and you're ignored. Or worse, watch. It's this mix of tension and delicacy that makes the samurai sex life feel like a kabuki play acted behind closed doors. Everything is choreographed. The audience is invisible. The stakes are personal, but the consequences are public. And there's no better example of this than the cases involving intimacy transgressions among higher-ranking officials. Take Lord Naotsune, for example. He was a daimyo famed for his military brilliance and his scandalous misstep with a concubine belonging to another retainer. Not just any concubine, but one whose status had been elevated by imperial permission, a rare honor. When news of the affair leaked, Naotsune wasn't punished for adultery. No, he was censured for damaging the prestige of bureaucratic endorsement. That's how tangled things were. It wasn't the act, but the breach of administrative hierarchy that drew fury. Naotsune lost his estate. His concubine disappeared from the record. And in her place, a poem appeared in the court chronicle. The ink was borrowed, not given. The scroll was signed in error. But it wasn't just powerful men caught in the net. Servants could be punished for witnessing too much. One young page was whipped not for spying, but for forgetting to knock loud enough before entering a room where a samurai and his legal wife were engaged in approved intimacy. His mistake: interrupting harmony. In this world, even the background actors had to know the scene. And yet, the more you learn, the more human it all feels. Behind every scroll is a person, yearning, calculating, fearing, hoping. Some warriors tried to sidestep the system. They bribed scribes, forged seals, or disguised their intentions in temple requests. One samurai famously claimed he was fasting in seclusion, only to be caught sneaking into his concubine's quarters with a bottle of plum wine and a basket of persimmons. His punishment? Assigned to a monastery to reflect. He returned a year later with 30 poems and a vow of chastity, only to be married off within the week to cement a new alliance. So much for abstinence. Still, there were others who accepted the system, even embraced it. For them, permission wasn't a burden, it was a form of foreplay. The anticipation heightened the encounter. The scrolls added gravity. One retainer, in a private letter, wrote, "When the steward delivers the scroll, I feel my chest bloom." It is the blossom before the storm. Romantic, sure, but it also reveals the emotional layering that emerged in such a restricted world. Intimacy became sacred precisely because it was rare, regulated, and wrestled from the jaws of bureaucracy. And for the daimyo, that control was essential. Remember, these lords were juggling military campaigns, estate politics, harvest quotas, and lineage games. If a trusted samurai fell into reckless passion, it could disrupt the entire chessboard. A child born at the wrong time might threaten succession. A mistress favored too openly might destabilize household hierarchy. And so permissions weren't just for show, they were strategy. Every union, every embrace, every whispered word behind closed doors was a potential ripple in the feudal pond. Even the architecture reflected this. In some estates, private quarters were built at a distance separated not just by space, but by gates, guards, and screened hallways. A samurai couldn't just wander into his wife's or concubine's room. He had to pass checkpoints. And sometimes, if permission was revoked, those gates were physically locked. One story from the Matsudra estate tells of a warrior who tried to bypass such a lock by bribing a night guard. The guard agreed, then reported him. The warrior was stripped of title and ordered to spend the winter guarding snow tools. His wife, incidentally, was later remarried to a rival retainer. The message, don't cheat the system, even for love. And yet, for all this control, desire never died. It merely adapted. Hidden love letters were tucked into sword hilts. Gifts of perfume and fabric passed hands with coded stitching. One popular embroidery pattern, chrysanthemums over waves, was understood to mean, I miss you when the house sleeps. Another, less subtle, used overlapping fans, a symbol of secret encounters. Women, too, played this game. One daimyo's daughter reportedly taught her maids to use incense to signal mood. Sandalwood meant yes. Patchouli meant no. Lotus meant ask again tomorrow. If anyone asked, they were just purifying the air. Historians still debate how widespread this incense code was, but the record of it shows just how creativity flourished under repression. And so, once more, you return to your mat, the candle. Now lower, its light a flickering whisper. The scroll has not arrived. You wait, breath held in that unbearable space between hope and protocol. Will tonight be allowed? Will a knock come before sleep? Or will you lie here, dreams unfulfilled, knowing that your desires, however quiet, however noble, must once again be folded away with the bedding until the next full moon, the next nod from your lord, the next chance to feel like more than just a weapon waiting for use. The paper screen slides shut with a sound like regret, and you're alone again in the quiet hum of sanctioned loneliness. No scroll tonight. No permission granted. Outside, a pine tree rattles in the wind, and the chill seeps through the cracks in the floorboards. You pull your robe tighter, not just against the cold, but against the ache of knowing your body belongs more to protocol than to passion. And here, in this moment of stillness, you remember that sometimes, love in the samurai world wasn't about permission at all, it was about subversion. Because for all the scrolls and stamps and ceremonies, not every passion could be predicted, not every touch scheduled. Tonight, we delve into the seductive power of letters. Not battlefield orders, not family crests, love letters, erotic poetry, secret verses exchanged between people who were never supposed to meet, let alone desire each other. And yet, they did. You might be surprised to know that many samurai were as fluent in calligraphy as they were in combat. Writing was not just a pastime, it was a necessity. A warrior who couldn't write was considered intellectually limp. So they trained. And eventually, many of them discovered that a perfectly placed metaphor could slice through a heart as sharply as any blade. And thus began one of the most elegant rebellions of the era, using beauty to bypass bureaucracy. You couldn't request intimacy? Fine. You'd send a poem you couldn't meet in person. You'd hide your feelings in folded fans and painted screens you couldn't touch. You'd write so vividly that your lover would feel your breath through the ink. Take, for example, the story of Ranjiro and a yam. He was a mid-level retainer. She was the daughter of a cloth merchant well below his social standing and utterly off limits. But she sold kimono to his lord's household, and one afternoon, as she wrapped fabric for delivery, he slipped a verse into the folds. Though I may never wear you, I carry your thread against my skin. Risky, stupid, absolutely forbidden, but she replied. A week later, in a parcel of plum-dyed silk, came her answer. This thread unravels at your touch. Pull gently, or not at all. Over the course of months, they wrote an entire romance. In 575 stanzas, he risked emotion. She risked exile. And yet, when her family moved to another city, it was said she wept not for the home she left behind, but for the lover she never touched. Historians found their correspondence, centuries later, preserved in a hollowed-out inkstone box beneath the floorboards of the estate. The ink had faded, but the heat remained. It wasn't just young lovers who used letters this way. Older retainers, even daimyo themselves, often kept volumes of private verses never meant to be read aloud. Eleanor Herman, in her writings on royal intimacy, discusses how passion, when forced underground, doesn't die, it distills. The same happened in Japan. One lord wrote to a concubine, "If the moon had lips, it would say your name across the courtyard." She responded, "And if the wind had arms, it would steal me to your chambers." They were never officially paired. She was dismissed during a household restructure, but her letters were found in his sash after his death. Worn like talisman. It's easy to think of the samurai as a motionless stoic, statues in lacquer and steel, but their letters tell another story. They loved deeply, if quietly. They grieved with discipline. They desired with precision. And when the official channels failed them, they turned to paper, to metaphor, to memory. The poetry wasn't just a creative outlet. It was a kind of intimacy encryption. If caught, a steward might not even understand the meaning. The cranes nested early this year might sound like birdwatching, but to the recipient, it meant, meet me at dawn, by the third bridge. Some of these letters were scented, folded with sprigs of pine or cloves, so the message arrived. Not just in words, but in smell. Others were singed slightly at the corners, a symbol of urgent, burning affection. There were rules, of course. You didn't use red ink unless you were declaring the end of something. You didn't use lavender paper unless it was a poem of mourning. And if you used gold leaf, that meant this letter was never to be read aloud. It was to be kept close, next to the skin, like a whisper pressed to the chest. But poetry was also dangerous. Too beautiful, and someone might suspect you were hiding something. Too plain, and your message could be ignored. One scholar from the Edo period even wrote a treatise on proper erotic subtlety, recommending that warriors suggest longing through season, not body, through shadow, not skin. That's how delicate the dance was. A misplaced metaphor could ruin lives. Still, the samurai persisted, because sometimes the only way to be seen was to write yourself into someone else's world, even if you couldn't touch. Even if you couldn't speak, even if the scroll was the closest your fingers would ever come to their warmth. And yes, sometimes these letters worked. Occasionally, a sympathetic steward might turn a blind eye. A concubine's status might quietly be adjusted. A daimyo, flattered by the quality of the verse, might grant one night after months of longing. One sanctioned touch like rain on a droughted field. And there were stories rare, but real of couples who used these poems not to ignite forbidden flames, but to rekindle fading ones. A husband and wife, long separated by politics or silence, might begin exchanging verses across their own estate. relearning each other through metaphor, rebuilding intimacy with ink. One such couple, Lord Takemura and Laddie Now, were known for their weekly poetic duels, where each would send a haiku mocking the other's housekeeping or swordsmanship. But beneath the jokes was a tenderness that servants whispered about. When she died, he buried her with a scroll that read, "I never learned to fold laundry, but I folded your laughter into my days." And so you see, not all desire was denied. Some of it simply had to be rerouted, reshaped, reimagined. It's like water in a stone garden, never flowing where you expect, but always finding a way. Tonight, as you lie back once more, maybe you can feel it, the rustle of paper, the scent of pine, the whisper of a verse tucked behind a folding screen. Somewhere in the layered silence of the past, a hand reaches for a brush, a heart steadies itself for confession. And though the world may forbid it, the ink flows anyway. You wake before the sun, as always, but this time something feels different. The air is still, heavy with meaning, like the pause before a storm. You sit up slowly, listening not for footsteps or scrolls, but for memory. Because today, you're expected to perform a different kind of duty. Not with a blade, but with a boy. And not just any boy, a wakashi, a youth assigned to your service as part of your education's second phase. His name is Koshiro. He's 30, nervous, and lithe as a willow branch in spring. He was assigned to you last week, but only. Today has the temple elder cleared your quarters for mentorship. It is an arrangement that is both ancient and murky, structured in tradition, yet filled with uncertainty. And yes, we must talk about it, this institution of wakashudo. Because it was as much a part of samurai life as polishing your sword or memorizing battle chants. And though the nature of it remains debated, its presence was undeniable. To our modern minds, the idea feels unsettling. And rightly so. But here, in this world of ink-stamped permissions and layered meanings, the relationship between adult warrior and adolescent page was layered in codes, emotional, philosophical, and yes, sometimes physical. It was not an act of impulse. It was, like everything else in samurai culture, a performance within a structure. You remember your own youth, how your mentor, Araki-san, had guided you not just in swordsmanship, but in poetry, in etiquette, in the art of presence. You had adored him, maybe even loved him, in a way too soft and complex for battlefield language. He never touched you, not that way, but he once spent an entire night reciting love verses by candlelight, saying, "If you learn to move hearts, you will never need to draw blood." Historians still argue whether these mentor-student relationships were universally physical or only occasionally so. Some argue they were purely emotional, modeled after spiritual brotherhood. Others point to surviving letters, paintings, and poems that hint at deeper intimacy, always veiled in seasonal metaphors, never direct. What is clear is that wakashudo was codified. It had rules. A warrior could not initiate without permission from the boy's guardian. The relationship was to be based on mutual respect. Coercion was condemned, at least in theory. The boy could, at any time, end the bond, though, in practice, such declarations were rare. More often, the relationship faded as the youth aged, replaced by camaraderie, silence, or arranged marriages. You rise now. Perform your ablutions with ceremonial slowness and light incense. Koshiro waits just outside the threshold, dressed impeccably, eyes lowered. He enters at your gesture, bows deeply. You bow in return, not just out of formality but out of genuine regard. You offer him tea, and he kneels across from you, hands perfectly placed. You speak not of intimacy, not directly. You ask about his dreams. He says he wants to be remembered. You smile, because you remember saying the same thing once, long ago, when Araki-san had poured you tea under a plum tree. And slowly, you begin the day's lesson, not with a sword, but with a poem. This was the heart of wakashudo, the blending of mentorship with emotion. Whether it turned romantic or remained spiritual varied case by case. One well-documented example involves a general and his page, whose letters survive in the National Archive. The boy, 17 by the time of the final letter, writes, "Your guidance shapes my blade, but your silence sharpens my longing." That single phrase has kept scholars arguing for decades. Was it unrequited love, a cry for attention, or simply a poetic flourish? Even Peter Webb, in his exploration of erotic spirituality, notes that in such deeply hierarchical systems, relationships often become charged with longing, not because of physical desire alone, but because intimacy itself becomes rare, almost sacred. In the samurai world, where emotional expression was constrained by endless protocol, a quiet look or a shared haiku could carry the emotional weight of a kiss. That's why so many warriors became poets. They weren't just showing off, they were surviving. And not all wakashudo relationships were melancholy or ambiguous. Some were joyful, filled with games, long walks, private jokes that never made it into the scrolls. A daimyo's memoir from 1623 includes an anecdote about his page crafting a paper frog that jumped whenever he whispered, "Rain," the Lord treasured it until the boy's departure, and wrote in his diary, "Even my enemies never moved me like that frog." Tender, ridiculous, and deeply revealing. Still, the practice had its critics. Even during its time, some monks and scholars questioned the ethics of such closeness. One noted cleric wrote, "A sword must be sharpened, not smothered in affection." Another compared emotional entanglement to a loose saddle strap, inevitably dangerous. There were even political consequences. A famous scandal involved a governor who favored his page so openly that it led to a minor rebellion among jealous retainers. The boy was blamed, exiled to a monastery, and later became a calligraphy master. His style, called falling pine, was known for its delicate, tear-like strokes. You wonder what will become of Koshiro. Whether he'll stay under your wing for years or be reassigned when the political winds shift. Whether you'll write him letters someday, tucked secretly into bundles of dried herbs. Whether he'll look back on this morning, this tea, this verse, and feel the same mix of reverence and awkward warmth that you carry still for Araki-san, you don't know. That's not your place to know. Your role is to teach him discipline, strength, grace, but also perhaps gentleness. The permission granted today is not sexual. It is something quieter, yet somehow more powerful. The permission to care. Later, after drills and calligraphy, you walk the garden path together. He asks if plum blossoms always bloom this early. You answer with a line from an old poem, "Only when watched with love." He smiles. That's enough. That's everything. You walk in silence. The wind brushes the bamboo leaves like a distant applause. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you wonder if this too will need a scroll someday. If feelings unacted, unspoken, but undeniable must eventually be submitted, signed, and filed. You hope not. You hope this stays in the space between. In the breath before the poem. In the glance that says nothing and everything. In the lesson that goes unwritten but never forgotten. Because while the world of the samurai is built on control, on duty and permission and endless structure, there are cracks in the lacquer. Places where feeling leaks through. And sometimes, just sometimes, those feelings find their way into the hands of the young, passed down not like weapons, but like poems, carefully, lovingly, without breaking the code, just bending it slightly. Like a reed in the wind, you've returned from the drills, your arms sore and tunic damp with the salt of discipline. The courtyard, swept clean by the junior servants, reflects the low sun like a pond made of dust. Yet, as you pass through the outer gate into the residence proper, there's a flicker of nervous anticipation in your chest, not because of swordsmanship, not because of inspection, but because you've been granted leave to visit Yoshiwara. Yes, that Yoshiwara, the fabled pleasure quarter, The dreamscape of lanterns and shamisen, where nothing is real, but everything is possible. Tonight, you're permitted to pass through the red lacquered gate, not as a soldier, but as a man with sanctioned desire. And even here, amid painted lips and perfumed sleeves, the rules still cling to you like shadow. The Yoshiwara district wasn't a place of unbridled chaos as some might imagine. It was theater. Elaborate, regulated, and astonishingly elegant. Women didn't beckon from balconies. They sat like empresses behind screens, their worth signaled by the silk of their sleeves and the cost of their combs. You didn't pick a courtesan, you applied for her company. You waited, sometimes days, for an answer. Even the process of entry was ritualized. Your name was announced at the gate, and your past visits were recorded in ledgers thicker than battle annals. Courtesans kept their own logs, too tiny, handwritten memoirs of conversation, touch, poetry exchanged, and yes, performance quality. If your visit was dull, you might find yourself politely refused on your next attempt, your coin not quite enough to outweigh your lack of verse. And so, here you are now, stepping from a palanquin onto the lantern-lit path. The air smells of sweet smoke and cherry bark, and laughter drifts like incense through silken curtains. The attendants bow, offering sandals of softer weave. A young woman, her hair lacquered into a shape that could survive a typhoon, greets you, not with a smile, but with a practiced glance, assessing your robes, your sword, your mood. You are led through winding corridors, past screens painted with cranes and moonlight, until you arrive in a chamber bathed in gold. And there she is, the Taiyu. Not just any courtesan, but one of the highest rank. She's dressed in 10 layers, each one hinting at a season or a poem or an emotion. Her face is a mask of powdered calm. She bows not low, not deeply, but just enough to acknowledge your presence without suggesting deference. Because here, in Yoshiwara, the power dynamic tilts ever so slightly. You may wield a sword, but she wields time. You may be lethal. She is immortal, at least for tonight. Your conversation begins with a riddle. That's the custom. She asks, if the moon drank sake, what would it say? You answer carefully. It would whisper what it forgets by dawn. She nods barely. You have passed the first test. Tea is served, not by her, but by an assistant trained in silence. You discuss the weather, the latest poem cycle released in Edo, a recent scandal involving a lord's parrot learning to mimic forbidden names. Only after 3 cups does she address you by name. And only then, when protocol has been satisfied, are you permitted to recite a verse of your own. You've practiced this all week. It's short and maybe a little dramatic, but you deliver it anyway. A river's bend remembers me, though I've never walked its shore. She looks at you, really looks, and says softly, then it is longing, not memory. That's the moment. The shift. The night is now yours, and yet, nothing physical happens not yet. First, music. A brief shamisen piece, played not for entertainment, but as emotional calibration. Then a gift exchange. You present a fan with your crest painted in saffron. She offers a sachet filled with lavender and mystery. The attendants bow again, and leave. Only then are you allowed to move closer, to touch the fabric of her outer robe, to ask, always ask if she is willing. Because even here, in the House of Dreams, consent is choreographed with sacred precision. A courtesan of her rank is not obligated to anyone. Not even the shogun. If she declines, the night ends in tea and poetry. If she accepts, the layers of silk begin to slip one by one, like verses forgotten at sunrise. And let us be clear, this is not an escape from samurai life. It's a mirror of it. In Yoshiwara, every gesture is steeped in symbolism, every breath controlled. It's not about raw pleasure. It's about elegant release, about experiencing desire without disrupting the world's balance. A Teiyu once wrote in her journal, "We do not sell the body. We lease the illusion of being understood." That's the service. That's the art. Still, under all the performance, something real flickers. One record tells of a samurai who returned to the same courtesan every spring for 10 years. They never consummated the bond. They shared only tea and poetry and silence. On his final visit, aged and half-blind, he left a scroll reading, "You held my name longer than any battlefield." She never opened it. She simply placed it among her collection of fans and wrote his death poem herself. Not every visit was so poetic. Some warriors lost themselves in the illusion. They borrowed coin, overstayed, embarrassed themselves with drunken confessions. These men were quietly blacklisted, or worse, summoned by their lords to explain their behavior. One, a young retainer who tried to elope with a courtesan, was reassigned to guard a firewood shed for 7 years. Upon return, he wrote a poem about kindling love and burning shame. It won 3rd place in a local contest. Progress, perhaps. There's a myth that the samurai were devoid of tenderness, that their code demanded emotional silence. But Yoshiwara proves otherwise. If anything, it revealed how desperate these men were to be known. Not worshipped, not feared, known. Under the armor, beneath the duty, there lived hearts that ached for understanding, for beauty, for something unearned. That's what Yoshiwara offered. A pause, a breath. A night when even warriors could be soft. And so, as your Teiyu pours the last cup of tea, her sleeve brushing your hand with studied accident, you understand why this place has endured in memory, long after its gates closed. It wasn't a brothel. It was a theater of longing, a sanctuary for the overburdened, a place where the samurai could set down his blade and speak without dying, just for a few hours. Just until dawn. The candle stub sputters once, then dies in a soft gasp of smoke. And you lie there in the hush that only Yoshiwara leaves behind, the weight of ritual, the scent of lavender still clinging to your sleeves, and the ghost of touch that wasn't quite touch. But before your thoughts drift too far into memory, another truth resurfaces, one less perfumed, more metallic. Because back home, beyond the brocade screens and sake-washed verses, there exists a different kind of power, one born not of longing, but of leverage. Tonight, we step into a quieter chamber of the samurai world, where sex was neither pleasure nor poetry, but strategy. You've heard of swords and scrolls, but now you learn the strange role celibacy played as a political tool. It starts not with desire, but with denial. There were moments in samurai life when refraining from intimacy wasn't just personal, it was a deliberate, tactical act. Sometimes it was imposed from above, but often it was chosen. Warriors, particularly those rising through the ranks, would publicly declare periods of sexual abstinence as a demonstration of discipline. The logic? If you could resist the pull of flesh, you could resist the fear of death. If you could control your passions, you could control your men. Abstinence became a symbol of loyalty, of razor-sharp focus, of readiness to die with no distractions. And that wasn't just performative, it was woven into rituals. Before a major battle, entire regiments were expected to observe seiken, a term that loosely translates to purification. This included no wine, no meat, and absolutely no physical contact, even with one's spouse. A samurai facing his final campaign might visit his wife to bow, not embrace. He might leave her a poem, a comb, or a folded piece of silk, but not a kiss. That would be seen as weakening his resolve. One record describes a warrior who, upon being seduced by his concubine the night before battle, intentionally slept in the stables as penance, writing in his journal, "I let the scent of her robe distract me from death. The horse smelled cleaner." But it wasn't always about battle. Sometimes it was politics. Imagine this. You've just been offered a promotion. A post closer to the daimyo, more power, more visibility. Suddenly, you stop visiting your mistress. You decline your wife's touch. Word spreads. He is focused. He is disciplined. He is loyal. Your self-denial becomes part of your brand. Like fasting, but with yearning instead of hunger. You're seen as incorruptible. Some men even went further, cutting off all emotional ties. One particularly intense example is Lord Ekafusa, who, after the death of his favored concubine, vowed never to lie with another woman again. He remained celibate for the next 27 years, claiming that his sword no longer needed polishing. His enemies respected him. His friends pitied him. His servants wrote haiku about his cold baths and colder silences. And here's where it gets truly fascinating. Sexual abstinence was sometimes used as revenge. A subtle passive-aggressive strike in the language of honor. A wife might withhold intimacy, not in anger, but in protest. A concubine, slighted by a missed poetry night, could quietly refuse her samurai's approach for weeks, forcing him to either grovel, gift, or risk scandal. And if a samurai wished to insult his superior without ever raising his voice, he could subtly imply he was refusing. His lord's gifts, that is, concubines offered as favor. One letter survives from a lower retainer that reads, "Though I am humbled by your generous offering, my spirit remains married to the sword this season." The implication? Thanks, but no thanks. A risky move. That warrior was demoted within a month. So much for subtlety. Even temples played a role. Many samurai, particularly those disillusioned or aging, took partial vows retreating to monasteries not to abandon the world entirely, but to reset, to regain clarity. In these spaces, celibacy wasn't symbolic, it was enforced. And yet, within those stone walls and incense-choked halls, longing didn't vanish. It simply changed shape. One monk warrior wrote in his journal, "I no longer seek warmth beside me, but I still dream of sleeves brushing mine in silence." Scholars point out that many such monks wrote more about absence than presence, crafting verses about echoes, shadows, half-remembered touches, as if desire, once silenced, sang even louder. And sometimes, the abstinence wasn't a choice at all. Some samurai, particularly those stationed in remote provinces or sent on long missions, went years without approved intimacy. Letters from these men often blend bitterness with dark humor. "My sword sees more action than I do," one wrote from a northern outpost. Another joked that he was considering marriage to a sake jug. "At least she never says no." But underneath the jokes was a deep strain of longing, and in some cases, disobedience. Because rules are made to be bent or broken, there are records carefully hidden, often euphemistic, of secret rendezvous between retainers and local villagers, of late-night meetings behind stables, of scribes forging permission slips for a small fee. One retainer, in a particularly elaborate deception, created an entire fake mistress, complete with signed scrolls and witness accounts, just so he could spend time alone without suspicion. He was caught only when a steward tried to arrange her visit and discovered she didn't exist. He was exiled. The steward, reportedly, was promoted, but the most astonishing story of abstinence as strategy involves a female samurai in Onibagesha, named Yuki of Sendai. Known for her ferocity in battle and her refusal to marry, she was often questioned about her solitary life. She once responded, "I do not share my sword, nor my bed. Both must remain sharp." Yet late in her life, letters emerged revealing a decades-long love affair, conducted entirely through ink and gifts. She and a fellow warrior exchanged tokens, comb fragments, dried flowers, locks of hair, but never touched. Not once. Her final letter to him read, "If this life denied us, may the next allow a single embrace." They were buried on opposite hills overlooking the same valley. In spring, the cherry trees between them bloom first. So tonight, as you lie back once more, limbs heavy from the weight of custom, maybe you feel it, that strange, solemn ache that comes not from indulgence, but from restraint. Because sometimes, in the world of the samurai, the absence of pleasure was more powerful than the act itself. Sometimes not touching was the ultimate form of control, or protest, or love. The room grows darker. Outside, a nightbird calls once. Then again. You shift, not from discomfort, but from the quiet realization that even in the most structured of societies, desire finds its way not in rebellion, but in the spaces between the rules. In the silence, in the waiting. The embers in the brazier are almost gone now, glowing faintly like forgotten memories under ash. You roll onto your side, but rest remains elusive. Something in your chest stirs, not anxiety, not desire exactly, but a hunger for understanding. All these rules, these rituals, the endless permissions and poetic half-confessions, they paint a portrait of a world not afraid of sex, but obsessed with controlling it. And just when you think you've untangled the last knot, you remember. Another layer, the seduction rituals. Because in samurai society, you didn't just ask for intimacy. You had to earn it, perform it, gift wrap it in metaphor, and sometimes in actual silk. Tonight, we open the sliding door on a surprisingly overlooked art, the elegant, choreographed seduction of the samurai class, where pleasure wasn't pursued with aggression, but with offerings, haiku, and a perfectly timed sleeve brush. Imagine this, it's midsummer, and your household has been granted an evening of celebration, rice harvest successful, the daimyo in good humor, and permission extended for domestic enjoyment. You've waited weeks for this. Not just for the green scroll authorizing a visit to your wife's quarters, but for the excuse to finally present your seduction gifts. Because in this world, sex isn't something you ask for with words. You ask with things. Scented fans, lacquered boxes, custom combs carved with auspicious patterns. These were not bribes. They were messages. A sachet of clove and sandalwood might whisper, "I want to remember your scent." A silk hair ribbon could mean, "Let your thoughts rest with me tonight." And a carefully chosen poem, wrapped in rice paper and tied with crimson string, was the most daring gesture of all. The message? I've thought of you enough to risk this verse. Because sending a poem was risky. If it was poorly received, it could be returned unopened. If it was too bold, it might trigger gossip. But if it was accepted, you had crossed the first bridge. Even husbands had to approach their wives with this level of subtlety. Marriages were strategic, sometimes affectionate, rarely passionate. So keeping desire alive required tact. One samurai manual on household management, written by an advisor to the Matsujira clan, included a section titled, "Evening approaches must be seasonally appropriate." Yes, seasonally appropriate. In spring, you could offer plum blossoms and metaphors about renewal. In summer, citrus scents and veiled hints at sleepless heat. Autumn called for melancholy verses, something about longing or falling leaves. Winter, the season of directness, but not too direct. One suggested line, "Though the nights are long, my thoughts are longer." The recipient wife, concubine, even favored companion, would respond with coded behavior. If she wore the ribbon you gave her, it meant interest. If she served your tea with both hands and didn't make eye contact, it meant maybe. If she deliberately used your gift in front of others, it meant no. Subtle, absolutely. Maddening? Undeniably. But this was the rhythm of the dance. There was no grabbing. No cornering. Not in respectable households. To push too quickly was to insult not just her, but yourself. Impatience was vulgar. Passion, poorly timed, was weakness. And then there were the poems. Oh, the poems. They were not Shakespearean sonnets or elaborate odes. They were short, weighted, 575, haiku, or sometimes the more personal tanka. You weren't just trying to impress. You were trying to stir something: curiosity, nostalgia, attraction. One famous exchange between a young samurai and his wife survives in a courtier's diary. His poem, "Your comb lies untouched. I dream of each black strand's path, tangled like my thoughts." Her reply, "If thoughts were a comb, I'd lend mine to smooth your mind once the house is still." You can practically hear the candle flicker at the end of that exchange. Even courtesans played by these rules. A tale would never accept. A client without a proper poetic offering, sometimes several. And not recycled ones either. Repeat a line, or borrow from a popular anthology, and you'd be dismissed with polite silence. One arrogant samurai, certain of his charm, sent a plagiarized poem to a courtesan known for her wit. She replied with a single line, "Your brush lacks its own bristles." His reputation never recovered. Seduction also came in the form of storytelling. Late-night gatherings often included tale exchanges, where guests would share folk tales, ghost stories, or accounts of tragic romance. To tell a story about longing without naming names was the most refined move of all. The lover with no name became a recurring character in such circles, always watching, always waiting, never claiming. Everyone knew such stories were thinly veiled truths. Everyone politely pretended otherwise. One such story, told by a middle-aged samurai at a winter gathering, described a woman who never spoke but left folded cranes in the path of her beloved. Each crane had a single character from a poem, and over a year, she completed a verse of parting. The final crane was found crushed under the lover's heel unread, unsent. Silence followed the tale. Then the host poured more tea, and nothing more was said. But not all gestures were so melancholy. There were playful ones too, perfume games for instance. These were gatherings where men and women would compare custom incense blends, trying to guess ingredients blindfolded. The winner often earned a token, sometimes a poem, sometimes a favor, flirting through fragrance. Or the fan toss, a festival game where players tried to land fans in a hoop across the room. A successful toss could mean a dance request or, in more private parties, an invitation to a night walk under lanterns. These games weren't about who won. They were about who noticed. Even touch, when it came, was stylized. You didn't reach. You brushed. You let your sleeve touch hers while handing a cup. You adjusted her collar just so. These moments, orchestrated to the second, were far more electric than anything explicit. Because in a world so full of rules, anticipation was everything. The possibility of intimacy, not its certainty, made the blood warm. And here's a detail that might surprise you. Sometimes, seduction was reversed. Women wives, concubines, even skilled servants, learned how to approach their partners with equal subtlety. A woman might leave a robe slightly open at the nape. She might write a reply poem that referenced a shared moment weeks prior. One famed Anna Bogeisha once challenged her suitor to a duel of metaphors. For each strike he missed, she required a verse. They sparred for hours. By the end, he was exhausted, and she had 5 poems, all of which survive in her memoir. The last reads, "Your sword missed again, but I feel each swing like breath. Strike once without steel." You think of these rituals now, lying in your room, the wind slipping under the door, rustling the paper screen. Somewhere nearby, a woman coughs twice deliberately. It might be a signal. It might be nothing. You wait, then rise. You reach for your inkstone, not your sword, and begin to write. Not because you expect a scroll in return, but because desire in this world must be offered, never claimed. Your brush moves like your thoughts, carefully, slowly, with too many pauses. And when you finish, you fold the paper once, then again. No ribbon, no seal. Just the poem, placed where it can be found. Maybe, if she chooses. Because in samurai seduction, it is never about possession. It is always about invitation. A dog howls somewhere in the outer village, its cry long and low like a bamboo flute played off-key. You stare at the rafters, hands still ink-stained from the poem you placed hours ago, wondering if it was read, if it was touched, if it was crumpled and tossed aside or slipped gently into a sleeve. In a world this tightly wound, feedback is a luxury, but you've learned by now that response is not always the point. Sometimes the act of writing is its own intimacy, and that brings you slowly into the next strange fold of samurai sexuality, where seduction isn't just courtship, but consequence. Because while you've seen how sex was withheld, granted, petitioned, and serenaded, what you haven't yet seen is how it was weaponized. Tonight, we explore the rarely spoken truth that intimacy in the samurai world could be a reward or a punishment, that it starts innocently enough. A daimyo, pleased with your military success, extends to you not gold, not land, but something far more ephemeral: access. An extra night with your wife, a special appointment with your registered concubine, maybe even a discreet introduction to one of the court's less visible companions. It's a gesture that seems soft, generous, but you understand immediately what it means. You've earned a privilege, not a pleasure. And privileges can be revoked. In elite households, where status shifted like autumn leaves, sexual access became a performance metric. You might be granted increased visits with your partner if your reports were thorough, your duels clean, your poetry properly melancholic. One daimyo's steward wrote in a household ledger, "Retainer Masaki, having secured a 3-village treaty and behaved with visible restraint at the peach blossom banquet, is hereby approved for double monthly companionship." Yes, intimacy on a point system, and it didn't stop there. If you faltered, say, raised your voice at a court function, or made a poorly timed joke, your privileges could vanish. Not with scolding, but with silence. No scroll, no message, just absence. The steward would say politely, "The timing is inauspicious." You'd nod, bow, and retreat. And inside, you'd boil. This gamification of sex created a strange economy of desire, one not based on love or connection, but on reputation and hierarchy. One servant might rise through proximity alone, his discretion rewarded with quiet access. Another, too loud with his joy, might lose it all. It became common knowledge among retainers. If your name was spoken too often in the pleasure corridors, your career was doomed. One samurai, beloved by a courtesan who sang his name in a seasonal song, was promptly reassigned to a mountain outpost. The message was clear: let no woman remember you more vividly than your commander. And then there's the darker side. Because if access could be granted, it could also be assigned. Imagine this: a daimyo arranges a liaison for you, not as a favor, but as a test. The woman is beautiful, accomplished, and absolutely beyond your social tier. She is, perhaps, even the former companion of your superior. You are told you've been chosen. An honor, they say. Decline, and you offend. Accept, and your every move is scrutinized. Do you linger too long? You're presumptuous. Leave too early? You're cold. What if you smile? What if you don't? There's no correct answer, only the hope that you misstep less than expected. Arrangements weren't always coercive, but they were rarely free. One letter from a 17th century warrior describes the anxiety of a gifted knight, in which he was presented with a woman he'd never met and told, simply, "Make her remember you." His account isn't graphic, it's clinical. He notes the color of her robes, the sequence of the conversation, the 3 approved subjects they discussed before touching hands. And then he writes, "I left as I arrived, carrying duty, not desire." Conversely, punishment could arrive not in the form of withheld intimacy, but forced abstinence. One common method involved the empty visit, a scroll delivered approving a conjugal visit, followed by a locked door or an absent partner. It was humiliating, but quietly. No one yelled. No one accused. You simply stood in a hallway with your scroll and your longing, and a servant offered you tea as if that could warm the place where pride used to be. One dismissed retainer described this in a letter to his cousin. Worse than exile. My desire was weaponized against me. I slept. That night with my armor beside me, colder than usual. Even among women, intimacy was not without consequence. A concubine who outshone the legal wife might be demoted or married off to a lesser retainer. One noble woman, Lady Asami, famously refused intimacy with her husband for nearly a year after being slighted in court. Her rebellion? She maintained the household flawlessly, dressed impeccably, and wrote the most devastatingly passive-aggressive poetry imaginable. Her best-known verse, "A cup left full is not untouched, it waits for better hands." Eventually, her husband begged forgiveness. She granted it, on her own terms, and then promptly resumed her abstention for spiritual clarity. Sex also appeared in political negotiations. Allied households often sealed treaties with arranged pairings, not always marriages, but sometimes temporary unions, carefully timed to align with agricultural festivals or state holidays. In one bizarre case, two rival families agreed to exchange daughters for a month each, to be treated with respectful affection. The logistics are baffling. Did they simply swap rooms? Was there a formal rating system? The records are vague, but one steward's note reads, "No disputes. Suitable incense exchanged. Peace retained. Make of that what you will." And then, of course, there were the public shame punishments, rare, theatrical, unforgettable. A retainer caught in a forbidden affair might be paraded not in chains, but in bridal attire. A man forced to walk the length of a courtyard holding a comb and wearing silk slippers too small. The message was not cruelty, it was absurdity. Make them laugh at your desire, and you will feel it turn to ash. One such punished warrior never married. Instead, he wrote gardening manuals and became obsessed with peonies, which bloom and wilt quickly. His final haiku? "Red silk underfoot, not mine, but memory's joke, petals never last." So now, as you lie back once more, you feel the strange weight of all this. How something so intimate could be wielded like a blade. How bodies became bargaining chips. How desire was turned into a ledger, entry approved, revoked, manipulated. And yet, people still found ways to make it real. To find meaning, even in permission. To share something true under all that lacquer and lace. Outside, the wind shifts. Somewhere, a door closes. You wonder if tonight's poem was read. If it stirred anything, or if it's already ash forgotten. You don't know. But you do know this. In a world where even your pleasure is ranked, withheld, and reported, choosing to feel anyway, to risk longing, is perhaps the greatest defiance of all. The rain begins before dawn, soft at first, like footsteps on old wood, then steady, then relentless, drumming its fingertips across the roof tiles in rhythm with your thoughts. You wake with the distinct sense of having dreamt something warm and unreachable. And as you lie still, letting the chill of the room ease into your bones, one name drifts back into your mind, like a leaf floating upstream. Tomo. Lady Tomo Gozen. Warrior, widow, legend. Tonight, we turn the page to a chapter often left out of polished scrolls and battlefield records. The world of female samurai, the Anabugeisha, and what it meant for them to feel desire in an empire built on male control. Because if you think the rules were suffocating for men, wait until you hear how women had to fight, not just for love, but for the right to feel it at all. Start with the armor, not the symbolic kind. Actual armor breastplates reshaped for smaller frames, chainmail sewn into ceremonial kimono, even horseback archery stances adapted for skirts. These women were not tokens. They trained from childhood. Tomo Gozen is said to have led troops into battle with her long hair braided tight and her blades sharper than any whisper in court. But behind every battlefield victory was a personal world just as fraught with expectation. Anabugeisha were expected to remain modest, restrained, and above all loyal, not just to their lord, but to the image of unshakable chastity. Romantic love, if it existed, was to be subdued. Desire? Ideally non-existent. A woman like Tamo, even after war, could not marry freely. Her identity as a warrior cast a long shadow. And any man who dared touch her risked being seen as either incredibly bold or hopelessly emasculated. There are no confirmed records of her lovers, only poems, unsigned, possibly hers, possibly for her. One reads, "I held the sword longer than the hand, and now both are gone." That's not just heartbreak, that's erasure. Many Anabogeisha were married off for alliances, just like their male counterparts, but their sexual agency was even more tightly constrained. A wife might be ordered to bear sons, yes, but a female warrior? She walked a finer line. Too many children, and she was seen as soft. Too few, and whispers of coldness followed her through the halls. One famous case involved Lady Mizaki, a brilliant tactician who refused 3 marriage proposals before her clan intervened and arranged a union with a lower-ranking but politically convenient man. On their wedding night, she reportedly handed him a sword and said, "Sleep beside me if you wish, but draw this if you try to command me." They never had children. They were never divorced. When she died, he retired to a monastery. Some say he carved her name into the bell he rang each morning. But what about intimacy? Surely some of these women loved, yearned, even desired. And they did, but always at a cost. Anabogeisha who chose their own partners, particularly lovers of equal or lower rank, were often punished. One was demoted to kitchen duties for sharing a single night with a poetry tutor. Another was forced to shave her head and serve in a temple after being caught exchanging gifts with a stable boy. These weren't lovers flouting rules in rebellion. These were women trying to feel human in a system that armored them twice once. With steel, once with silence. Yet, despite the risks, love found ways to flicker in the shadows. Consider the story of Akiko, a mid-ranked Anabogeisha stationed at a border fortress. She served as a communication officer, translating coded messages and battle reports. Her closest companion was a younger woman, Noriko, trained in herbal medicine. Over years of late-night study and quiet dinners during festivals, they grew close. Letters passed between their rooms, some about military strategy, others written in layered metaphor. One note, preserved in a fragment, reads, "The ink you lend stains even my dreams. I will not wash it out." When Akiko was reassigned, Noriko sent her a small pouch of dried plum blossoms. Neither married. Their story exists only in rumors and a few surviving lines of poetry etched into the margins of a strategy manual. And there were other, subtler revolutions. Women who maintained relationships in secret, who met lovers during temple retreats under the pretext of pilgrimage, who created private codes of gesture and scent to signal longing without ever breaking a vow. One woman reportedly wore a specific perfume blend camphor and peach blossom only when she wished to see her partner. If he returned the scent the next day, the meeting would happen. If not, she waited, sometimes for weeks, sometimes forever. Even within marriage, female samurai faced unique constraints. While men had access to concubines, mistresses, and the pleasure quarters, women were expected to remain emotionally and physically exclusive. And if their husbands lost interest, too bad. A wife who expressed dissatisfaction risked being labeled unruly, or worse, dishonorable. One samurai wife wrote in her diary, "His silence burns louder than my vows." She died childless, surrounded by calligraphy scrolls and untouched tea sets. Yet, not all stories end in quiet longing. Some women fought back not with blades, but with ink, with humor, with quiet defiance. Lady Hana, a former military courier, once discovered that her husband had taken a young mistress from the pleasure quarters. Rather than confront him directly, she began writing fictionalized accounts of their household under a pen name. Her stories, thinly veiled satire, became popular in nearby villages. When her husband found out, he demanded she stop. She refused. Instead, she doubled her output and added illustrations. Eventually, he left. She kept the house. She kept writing. Her final known story ends with the line, "The sword sheathed itself, and still, the ink poured freely." There's also the curious case of the Mirror Pact, a rumored agreement between two noble women who, both trapped in passionless marriages, exchanged letters, tokens, and possibly lovers in a carefully orchestrated scheme to support each other's desires without alerting their lords. One letter fragment from the supposed pact reads, "Should I fall silent, remember the mirror. You are the reflection I chose when none were offered." Whether the Mirror Pact truly existed is still debated by historians. But the very idea of it has become legend, whispered in university halls and late-night readings of Edo period erotica. And yes, even erotica played a role. Though samurai households rarely admitted to owning them, illustrated pillow books circulated among women, too often shared discreetly between maids, concubines, and even noble daughters. Some included depictions of same-gender intimacy, often romanticized as pure or unspoiled by hierarchy. Others were more practical, offering diagrams of positions with coy advice like, "Best attempted when snow has softened the tatami." So tonight, as the rain trickles down the paper screen beside you, think of them, the women who fought battles by day and navigated desire through a labyrinth of rules by night. The ones who loved without permission, who wrote poems they could never read aloud, who stood guard over their hearts as fiercely as any gate. Their stories aren't always loud. Sometimes they're just a crease in a letter, a scent that lingers, a name carved softly into stone. But they remind you that even in the most rigid societies, intimacy will always find a way, not by breaking the rules, but by bending them. So gently they never hear the crack. You've read enough poetry to know that not every ghost wears a white robe or rattles chains. Some wear perfume. Some arrive with folded sleeves and vanish before dawn. Some live in the folds of memory, so soft you mistake them for a breath, until suddenly you realize you're speaking their name without knowing why. And in the world of the samurai, where every touch was recorded, every glance measured, there was no shortage of ghosts. Tonight, as the rain turns to mist and the wind carries the scent of pine through the cracks in the floorboards, we descend into the eerie, hushed corridors of a different kind of consequence, the lingering spirits of desire denied, of love punished, of longing gone too far. Tonight, we meet the ghosts of those who broke the rules of samurai intimacy and paid a price that outlived their bodies. These weren't the dramatic, blood-soaked stories of battlefield betrayal. No, the most unsettling hauntings came from transgression's quiet and private unapproved romances. Secret liaisons, love that bloomed where it wasn't planted. And the samurai believed, truly believed, that the emotional residue of these betrayals could stick like candle soot on silk, refusing to fade even after death. It wasn't uncommon for a retainer to leave an offering, not at a shrine, but in the corner of a bedroom where a former lover had died or had been sent away. A comb, a slip of paper, a tiny wrapped sweet, untouched. The implication was clear, I remember. I regret. Please don't return angry. Take the case of the House of Itwu, whose youngest son, Harunobu, fell in love with a maid named Aisa. She wasn't registered as a concubine. Their meetings were forbidden. But they persisted, exchanging letters in the pages of cookbooks and meeting at night under the garden lanterns. When their affair was discovered, Harunobu was not executed. He was sent away to serve in a border region plagued by wolves and rebellion. Aisa, however, was dismissed without record. No one knows what became of her. But from that day forward, every maid assigned to Harunobu's former quarters claimed they heard weeping at night. Soft, steady, scented with plum. One even wrote in a log, "She cries when the ink dries. I leave her paper. Then there's the story of the white sleeve bride. In a Kyoto estate during the Genroku era, a young samurai named Junichiro fell for a widow older, elegant, with a laugh like wind through reeds. Their affair was brief but consuming. She embroidered a single sleeve of his sleeping robe with a heron in flight, her favorite bird. When Junichiro's father arranged his marriage to another, he ended the affair with a single line. The heron must land. The widow vanished. At his wedding, when the bride entered the room, her sleeve caught fire just one, the left, the heron's place. No one could explain it. The bride survived, but refused to sleep in that house again. Junichiro lived in silence for years. He died childless, and every time the wind changed, the heron's sleeve would appear in the doorway just for a moment, before melting into air. These stories weren't dismissed as superstition. They were recorded, commented on, even addressed in household manuals. One 18th century guide for estate stewards includes a section titled, Concerning Restless Spirits in Private Quarters. It recommends regular incense offerings, nighttime silence, and the recitation of farewell poems to aid lingering attachments. The implication? If your lord's former lover died badly, you'd better learn a few good verses. Just in case, some hauntings were less visible, more behavioral. A samurai who refused all touch after the disappearance of a beloved concubine. A concubine who slept with her face turned to the wall for years after her partner was reassigned. One wife kept a shrine made entirely of items her husband had touched before taking his final campaign. Chopsticks, a hair tie, a single sandal. When asked why, she said, "His soul steps here when mine forgets him." No one questioned her. The sandals remained untouched for 2 decades. And when she died, the household buried her beside them. But not all spirits were mournful. Some were vengeful. A scribe's records from a coastal estate tell of a warrior who mistreated a courtesan, took her by force, then laughed about it. In court, she was dismissed, her reputation ruined. Months later, during a summer festival, he collapsed in the middle of a procession. No wounds, no poison, no sign of illness. Just dropped like a puppet whose strings were cut. Witnesses claimed they heard a woman's laughter just before he fell. Like bells tied to spite, one guard said. His family built a shrine to a nameless woman beside the estate wall. The laughter stopped. But no one ever walked that path again at night. Even among women, stories spread. A young lady of the court once fell in love with a traveling poet. He left her with promises. She waited. 3 years passed. Then 4. Finally, she received news. He had married a merchant's daughter and never mentioned her name again. She retired to a temple, refused all visitors. On certain nights, the temple bell would toll on its own 3 times, soft and low. The monks, at first, blamed wind, but after finding a poem carved into the underside of her sleeping mat, the echo of a promise rings deeper than its sound. They stopped offering explanations. The bell remains, cracked and unmended, to this day. What ties all these tales together isn't just sorrow, it's silence. These ghosts don't wail or howl. They sigh, they rustle, they weep into sleeves. They're not angry because they were denied love. They're angry because love was treated like a battlefield maneuver. And perhaps that's the most haunting part of all. That even in a culture where honor was everything, the heart had to beg for space. That permission was needed not just to touch, but to mourn, to regret, to remember. Some households began building listening rooms, small side chambers filled with soft cushions and incense, where former lovers could be addressed, placated, even apologized to. These weren't religious spaces. They were emotional closets. One estate kept a tiny pillow, embroidered with 2 names. No one ever claimed it, but it was cleaned weekly, just in case. So as you lie back now, the wind curling like breath along your neck, ask yourself, what is more terrifying? The ghost of someone you loved, or the memory of love you were never allowed to have. In this world, both exist, and they are very, very quiet. The rain has stopped, but the world hasn't remembered how to be warm again. You sit by the window, watching mist cling to the tiled rooftops, thinking about everything unsaid in the last 24 hours, poems unwritten, robes unread, glances uncaught. It's strange, isn't it, how silence sometimes feels louder than a battlefield. And now, with the air heavy and the household still half asleep, your thoughts drift again, not to war, not to scrolls or swords, but to the strange, monastic overlap between warrior and monk. Because as unlikely as it sounds, the line between temple and barracks was thinner than paper. And yes, we need to talk about it. Tonight, we step into the quiet, incense-filled spaces where samurai and monks shared food, fire, philosophy, and sometimes a futon. It begins, as always, with practicality. Temples in feudal Japan weren't just spiritual centers. They were fortresses, schools, hospitals, and in some cases, boarding houses for warriors seeking clarity, exile, or simply a place to disappear. A disgraced retainer might be invited to study silence at a mountain temple. A young samurai with literary talent could be sent to copy sutras under the supervision of celibate, unsmiling monks. But beneath the formality and shaved heads was a strange intimacy. Living quarters were often shared, meals eaten side by side. Walls were thin, winters were cold, and isolation softened hierarchy. In that space, something else began to take root. Not scandal, but closeness. Historical accounts, usually written with careful vagueness, speak of emotional mentorships formed between monks and samurai in residence. The monks offered more than food and fire. They offered listening, reflection, an end to performance. For a samurai trained to perform masculinity through stoicism, blood, and command, this quiet witness could be intoxicating. One letter from a samurai posted to a remote mountain temple reads, "He hears me without looking, and yet I feel seen. He speaks like snow falling on wood." Was it love? Possibly. Was it physical? Perhaps. But it was undeniably something, and it filled the spaces between rice bowls and chanting. Monks, for their part, weren't always the austere celibates imagined by romantic Western fiction. While many practiced strict discipline, others lived within more flexible sects. Some monks were known to form attachments, deep friendships with disciples or guests that transcended mere mentorship. In rare cases, temple records hint at shared sleep arrangements, particularly during travel or festival hosting. One record from a temple in Nara notes, "It is cold. He sleeps beside me for warmth. There is no shame. The wind watches, not the world." Make of that what you will. Then there were the spiritual bonds far less debated, but no less intimate. A monk might teach a warrior how to meditate, how to sit with death, how to observe thought like breath. In this shared silence, connections formed not through conversation, but through presence. One warrior wrote, "He placed a single stone in my hand and said nothing. I still carry it." Another described a monk's daily tea ritual as the only ceremony that made me forget my sword. In such proximity, attachment was inevitable, forbidden sometimes, but rarely named. And occasionally, the bonds deepened into something both romantic and tragic. There's a tale half documented, half legend of a monk named Senzu and a young warrior named Reiki. Reiki was assigned to the temple after an outburst at court, a punishment meant to humble him. Senzu was tasked with his instruction. Over the course of 2 years, they studied calligraphy, poetry, and garden design. Letters between them survive soft, layered, coded. "You trimmed the plum tree too early," Senzu writes. Reiki replies, "Only because I feared it would bloom without you seeing." Their story ends with Senzu's exile after an anonymous complaint. Reiki returned to court. He never married. The plum tree was said to bloom late every year after that. Not all stories ended in exile. Some monks and samurai formed lifelong friendships, quiet alliances that never needed names. One famous general, known for his brutality in battle, kept a temple bell from a friend who once shaved his head during a fever. When the general died, the bell was rung every year on the anniversary. No prayers, just a single sound, resonant, private. These quiet bonds didn't go unnoticed. Some lords grew suspicious of the influence monks had over their retainers. In one province, it became customary to assign 2 guards to every samurai posted at a monastery, officially for protection, but unofficially for surveillance. A letter from one such guard survives, bitter and amused. They study moonlight like it's a sword. I've never seen so much silence be so loud. Yet despite scrutiny, the practice endured. Even daimyos themselves occasionally retreated to temples, whether in disguise or in formal penance. And in those spaces they too sometimes formed attachments. A particularly poignant example comes from Lord Kagemitsu, who, after ordering the execution of a concubine accused of betrayal, withdrew to a mountaintop retreat. There, he was cared for by an older monk, known only as Sho. For 6 months, Kagemitsu did not speak. Sho never asked him to. When Kagemitsu finally descended the mountain, he resumed his duties without question, but kept Shu's walking stick in his personal chambers. No one dared ask why. Modern historians debate how widespread these bonds were. Some argue they were isolated, products of specific personalities and poetic exaggeration. Others suggest they were part of a broader, unspoken culture of emotional refuge and necessary counterbalance to the violence and repression that defined the samurai world. Peter Webb, in his writings on historical intimacy, proposes that such relationships existed in a vacuum of sanctioned gentleness. When all softness is forbidden, kindness becomes a rebellion. And where there is kindness, love will grow, whether named or not. And then, of course, there are the physical spaces left behind. Small guest rooms with twin futons still neatly aligned. Temple gardens designed with pairs of stone lanterns, one always slightly leaning. Shrines with nameless plaques there. Wood weathered, their meaning blurred. Some say these are simply accidents of design. Others believe they are memorials. Not to famous warriors or enlightened monks, but to something quieter, a hand held, a bowl passed. A winter survived in the silence of someone who truly understood you. So as you sit now, listening to the mist melt from the rooftops, ask yourself, what is the shape of love when it's not allowed to speak? In the samurai world, maybe it looked like a shared teacup. Maybe like a brushstroke echoed on someone else's scroll. Maybe just like the sound of someone breathing beside you, without expectation, without fear, without anything to prove. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. You wake to the scent of something you can't name, faint, deliberate, and unmistakably meant for you. It lingers in the room like a whispered secret, left just above your pillow. Not the heavy clove of ceremony, not the everyday cedar of your robe chest, but a layered blend rosewood, crushed mint, maybe a hint of burnt orange peel. You sit up. Slowly, still not speaking, because words would make it ordinary, and this is not ordinary. This is a message. Not in ink, not in silk, but in scent. And you know exactly who it came from. Tonight, we unravel the almost forgotten language of samurai-era seduction perfumes and love letters, a delicate, curated world where fragrance and ink said what mouths couldn't dare to speak. Before text messages, before secret glances across banquet halls, there was caught the way of incense. A sensory art form older than kabuki, more intimate than music, and quiet enough to carry all the weight of longing without ever raising a whisper. Samurai were expected to train in it, not just how to recognize incense, but how to blend it, how to signal with it. Because in a society that demanded silence and restraint, scent became a private rebellion, a trace of emotion disguised as ritual. A sigh in smoke, A well-crafted scent could mean everything. A noble woman might perfume her letter with a blend of argarwood and iris to suggest patience, or clove and chrysanthemum for veiled sadness. A samurai's travel letter might carry only sandalwood, stoic, heavy, present even when he wasn't, but those trained in the art knew the deeper codes. One combination, patchouli, black pine, and orchid meant, "I want to see you tonight." Another, rosemary, plum blossom, and bamboo ash, whispered, "Wait for me, they are watching." These weren't just preferences. They were maps. Drawn ear dot, and then there were the letters themselves. Not the formal, court-approved kind, the private ones. Folded 12 times, slipped under a sleeve or into the lining of a tea gift, sealed with nothing but heat and hope. These letters, always handwritten with deliberate imperfections, an extra curl on the final stroke, a smudge from the writer's own sleeve, were personal fingerprints. No two were the same. One might open with a poem, another with a single sentence and nothing more. "I watched the candle burn out before your name did." Some were never delivered, tucked into boxes, burned at altars, hidden in inkstone drawers by those two, afraid to risk the consequences of being read. One famous example from the early 1700s tells of two retainers, Kenshiro and Nobuki, who corresponded for nearly a decade through incense and coded ink. Each letter began with a different kanji character, which, when arranged chronologically, spelled out a secret verse. They never wrote each other's names, never included dates. But when their letters were found, years after both had died in service, the scrolls revealed a complete poem, 31 syllables, wrapped in longing and winter metaphors. It ended, "I served him in silence, but my ink bled through the scroll where his name once slept." Love letters weren't only exchanged in ink. Sometimes warriors would send small fabric tokens, part of a robe, the end of a sleeve sprinkled with crushed incense and wrapped in a riddle. The recipient was expected to interpret the blend, the fold, the stitch. If they wore it to their next shared event, it meant yes. If they returned it unopened, the answer was no. A warrior named Ritsuo was said to have once sent his lover a single glove, dusted with cinnamon and dried rose. The reply? A sandal soaked in rainwater, tied with a hair ribbon. No one knew what it meant, but Ritsuo stopped smiling for months afterward. And these weren't just romantic gestures. They were acts of resistance, of preservation. A way to claim back something unclaimable in a world that monitored even your breath. One temple servant reportedly composed incense blends for two lovers who weren't permitted to speak in public. Each morning, they would burn a different scent in their quarters, visible from across the compound. If the smoke curled blue, it meant danger. If pink, it meant longing. If the air remained still, they had met in secret. This continued for 7 years. When the younger of the two died in battle, the other burned all remaining blends in a single night. Witnesses said the smoke filled the temple like a storm. For days, the air carried perfume. No one said a word. Even the act of writing became part of the seduction ritual. Calligraphy, after all, wasn't just about clarity. It was about rhythm, stroke, pressure, speed. Samurai were taught that your brush revealed your heart. A quick dash might mean desperation. A long curved line meant tenderness. A single ink drop beside a character, regret. Some lovers developed entire systems of brush signals. One wrote a letter with no words at all, just dots, lines, and blank spaces. The reply, "You wrote me better than I deserved." And then came the games. Scent guessing games kumiko, where participants blindfolded themselves and tried to name incense blends. On the surface, innocent, elegant, educational. But in private, the stakes changed. Lovers would blend custom scents, placing hints of their own perfume into the mix. If their partner guessed correctly, it meant recognition. If not, a second attempt, this time with guidance. One record mentions a courtesan who designed an entire suite of incense themes for her patron, each one tied to a different memory. A storm they watched together, a spilled cup of tea, the first time he touched her hand. He never missed a single one. Of course, not every scent was welcome. Sometimes, perfumes were used as warnings. A bitter mix of camphor and sulfur might be sent to an unwanted suitor. A blend of wormwood and cold ash signaled the death of affection. One noble woman famously returned a love letter with her late husband's funeral incense folded inside. The message was cruel, final, and unforgettable. Her suitor reportedly shaved his head and joined a monastery the next morning. His incense from then on was only sandalwood, pure, penance, and so, tonight, as you lie back once more, the scent still clinging to your sleeves, think about all the things that were never spoken aloud. All the words burned into air, folded into fabric, smeared in ink. In a society that asked you to mute your feelings, your perfume spoke for you. Your brush betrayed you. Your folded sleeve shouted where your mouth could not. And in that strange, scented silence, love took root, not in declarations, but in fragments. In smoke. In memory. Because sometimes the most powerful messages are the ones that vanish as soon as they're understood. It's just before twilight when the summons arrives, not the scrolls you've grown used to, not the perfumed envelope of seduction, or the stiff brushstrokes of military decree. This one is different. Thicker paper, sealed in wax with no crest, no name. Just a single handwritten kanji for listen. You don't hesitate. You press it to your chest for a moment, then slide it open. Inside, no words. Only a charcoal rubbing of a handprint, delicate and unmistakably feminine, smudged slightly at the wrist. You understand immediately. It's not a message, it's an echo. And that's where we go next, into the soft flickering realm where intimacy leaves behind not poetry or scandal or ghosts, but memory. Tonight, we trace how samurai remembered their lovers, not in loud declarations or etched gravestones, but in keepsakes, rituals, and the almost sacred act of carrying a person. Long after they'd left, you might expect warriors so steeped in duty and repression to let go of lovers easily. But history suggests the opposite. Samurai clung to affection like it was a battlefield wound, unspoken, untreated, but undeniably there. They carried tokens, scribbled fragments of poems, sleeves torn from robes, even teeth from burned corpses. Not morbid, reverent, as if to say, this mattered, even if no one saw it. A famed example lies in the journals of Lord Matsunaga, who served during the Tokugawa consolidation. After the death of a concubine he was never permitted to acknowledge publicly, he wrote her name small, careful, hidden at the corner of every battle map he carried. 27 maps survive. Each one bears her name, always in the same ink. Always behind a fold. Never seen unless you knew where to look. And there were others, less poetic, more visceral. A mid-level retainer once sewed a lock of his lover's hair into the hilt of his wakizashi. He told no one. It was only discovered when he fell in battle, and a fellow soldier took up the blade. That soldier, upon learning the truth, reportedly refused to use the weapon and instead wrapped it in silk and buried it beneath the tree where the man had proposed. The tree still stands. Locals call it the bride's shadow. No one touches its roots. Memorialization didn't always take physical form. Sometimes it lived in routine. A samurai might pour 2 cups of tea each morning, drinking one and leaving the other to cool. Not superstition, memory. Another might kneel at the same garden stone before bed, whispering names no longer spoken aloud. And some wrote endless verses tucked into the margins of scrolls, onto the backs of receipts, even on the paper used to wrap sword polish. One discovered scroll reads, "The ink fades faster than you did. I'm still waiting." But perhaps the most fascinating tradition was that of the silent shrine. These weren't temples. They weren't altars. They were spaces, a window seat, a patch of tatami, a cabinet drawer dedicated quietly to someone lost. Inside, one or two objects, never more. A hairpin, a torn sandal, a folded fan with a broken slat. These items weren't arranged like offerings. They were lived beside, left alone. They aged with the house. Some stewards made records of these spaces in estate logs. Room 2, West Alcove reserved, untouched. No explanation. Just a note of deference. One widow, Lady Ray, kept a basket of her husband's travel robes by the door for 32 years. Not cleaned, not moved. When asked why, she said, "He forgot something. I'm holding it until he remembers." Upon her death, the robes were found to contain several letters, unread, unsent, unsigned. Just names and dates and pressed sakura petals, now faded to ghosts of color dot, and yet memory wasn't always tender. Sometimes it hurt, and sometimes that hurt was worn like armor. A samurai named Gori, jilted by a court musician who chose. Another reportedly painted her likeness onto the inside of his helmet. No one knew until a battle injury shattered the helm, revealing the image. Witnesses claimed the woman's eyes were painted closed. Whether to preserve her or to forget her, no one could say. Some memories became cautionary. One household banned the keeping of romantic keepsakes altogether after a former retainer was caught reciting a dead lover's name in his sleep. They believed it cursed the estate. He was sent away. The shrine he built in the mountains, made of river stones and comb fragments, still receives offerings to this day. Hikers leave incense. Children whisper questions. The wind, they say, always answers in verse. And while men often get the spotlight in these stories, women remembered just as fiercely. A concubine in a daimyo's household was known to embroider initials into the hems of every robe she owned. No one noticed for years. When she died, her garments were passed to the servants. One maid discovered the threadwork hundreds of tiny stitches, all spelling out the same name. She brought it to the Lord. He burned the robes, but he ordered a scroll written with that name, placed it in the household archive, and marked the entry only with, "She knew him longer than I did." Some memories cross generations. A retainer's son once found a locked box in his father's storage room, containing only a fan, a sachet of worn incense, and a strip of silk with a single line of poetry. "You bowed too low the last time." I still see it. The son, instead of opening the box fully or destroying it, added a note of his own. "Father, I hope she knew." He resealed the box and buried it. Years later, his granddaughter wrote a play based on its imagined contents. It was banned for being excessively intimate, and there were even those who trained memory into the body. Sword routines practiced in pairs, one side absent. Dances performed alone, but with hands always reaching. Tea ceremonies where the second cushion remained empty. These weren't performances. They were rituals. One monk who served a retired samurai described him as a man who kneels like someone is still watching. And maybe someone was so now, as you sit in your own quiet room, incense fading into the corners, scrolls tucked beneath your pillow. Think about the handprint, smudged, incomplete, intentionally so. It doesn't ask you to remember, it assumes you already do. Because memory, in this world, is not a moment. It is a practice, a repetition, a way of keeping someone alive in the exact place they last touched you, and if they return only in dreams, in scent and ritual, they will know exactly where to find you. You've been summoned. Not to the practice yard, not to the temple or the pleasure district. This time, you're called to the archive. A place so silent, the dust has its own sound. You remove your sandals at the threshold, as instructed, and step onto tatami so old. It exhales every time you move. At the far end of the chamber sits the steward, surrounded by scrolls tied in red string. No emotion on his face, no welcome, just a gesture to kneel. And then, without speaking, he presents a scroll marked for retainer's eyes only. You know before you open it that this will not be poetry, it's a list. A detailed, clinical, breathtakingly meticulous record of every permission granted, every union approved, every deviation noted. This, you realize, is the sex ledger. Welcome to the most bureaucratic corner of samurai intimacy, the cold, precise world of record-keeping, where even desire had to be documented. It's surreal at first. Names, dates, schedules, notations on compatibility and bloodline. A note beside one couple's name reads, approved for seasonal cohabitation. Likelihood of conception low due to astrological misalignment. Another simply says, see incident file number 36A. These aren't lovers. They're data points. And yet, each line represents something deeply personal. A shared night. A sigh. A decision that someone else had to stamp. Sex wasn't private. It was processed. Requests for conjugal time had to be filed in writing, often weeks in advance, reviewed by a steward, and logged in the estate ledger. For high-ranking samurai, these decisions were sometimes made by entire councils men who determined, based on lineage charts and strategic goals, when and how intimacy could be pursued. Imagine needing a committee's approval before you could hold your spouse's hand, or being told that, due to upcoming rice audits, your conjugal night would be rescheduled to the next lunar cycle. The term used was delayed with honor, but to you, it felt like erasure. And if a child was conceived, that too was entered alongside details of the parent's social standing, astrological compatibility, and previous reproductive history. One line in the ledger reads, second son of Hiroki Inema. Conception during moon phase doku. Potential for melancholic temperament. That's not mysticism. That's policy. Because in this world, even your child's mood was a bureaucratic forecast. But the ledger didn't just record success. It documented failure. A red mark might indicate denied access. A black line through a name could mean dishonor. Multiple petitions submitted without proper spacing. Improper incense offering before visit. Unauthorized presence of third party during intimate hours. These weren't just technicalities. They were violations of protocol, sometimes resulting in reassignment, demotion, or social exile. One particularly striking entry tells of a concubine who requested more frequent access to her partner, citing emotional disconnection. The response: affection is not required. Progeny is sufficient. Her name disappears from the scroll shortly afterward. No cause given, just a note, replaced. Whether that means she left or was removed, or simply stopped being worth recording, no one knows. These records were kept not just for organization, but for legacy. When a daimyo died, his household's sexual history was reviewed as part of the succession process. Who had fathered whom? Which unions were legitimate? Which ones were inconvenient? There are documented cases of sons being disinherited because their conception had not been properly registered. Imagine being erased from your own family because a scroll was misplaced, or because someone forgot to light the correct incense before intimacy. That's not fiction. That's history. And then there are the hidden entries. The ones written in code, certain symbols and extra slash, a change in ink color, a folded corner indicated off-ledger relationships, affairs, hidden concubines, unauthorized lovers. These notes were never public, but they were kept, like secrets whispered, into an urn. And while most were never investigated, some triggered entire inquiries. One retainer's affair with a kitchen assistant was discovered not because they were caught, but because the assistant's name appeared in a medicinal supply log on the same night the retainer submitted a poem-requested visit to his official partner. That overlap? Enough to raise suspicion. They were both reassigned. Different provinces. No goodbyes. Sometimes, these records were weaponized, used as leverage in estate disputes, marriage negotiations, even political scandals. A concubine's lineage called into question? Pull her registry. A potential heir's legitimacy challenged? Check the lunar logs. One daimyo reportedly kept a secret archive in a separate chamber, accessible only to him, containing over 50 scrolls of blacklisted unions' relationships, never meant to be acknowledged. His successor found them years later. He burned them all. No reason given, just a final note. Let them rest. Despite their cold precision, these records weren't heartless. Occasionally, emotion peeked through. A steward might add a personal line. He smiled for the first time in months. Or, she wept after permission was granted. One scroll includes a pressed cherry blossom beside a child's birth entry. No explanation. Just beauty, quietly inserted into bureaucracy. But even so, the system remained merciless. You could be the most loyal retainer, the most passionate lover, and still be denied. Your feelings didn't matter. Your petitions could be ignored. Or worse, approved at the wrong time, in the wrong way, setting off a chain of consequences you couldn't control. There's a story of a samurai named Deki, who filed for intimacy on the night of a blood moon, unaware it was considered an ill omen. His child, born from that union, was deemed cursed. Not publicly, but within the ledger. The word used was anxious lineage. When Deki tried to arrange a marriage for the boy 15 years later, every family declined. The boy eventually became a wandering monk. His temple name? Tsukagige Moon Shadow. Some say he still burns copies of birth ledgers as a form of penance. And so, as you sit in this archive, scroll in hand, you realize the most disturbing truth of all. This ledger knows you better than you know yourself. It remembers every touch, every absence, every approval you were too nervous to ask for. And it doesn't care. It's not cruel. It's not kind. It's just ... complete ... But as you stand to leave, you notice something strange. A corner of the shelf, tucked behind the last scroll. A tiny folded paper crane, old and yellowed, perched on nothing. No name attached, no reason for it to be here. You lift it. Underneath, carved into the wood, I loved once. Do not record this. You carry the image of that paper crane with you all day. Not physically, it stayed behind in the archive, nestled back into its hiding place. But it follows you like perfume clinging to your collar. That tiny crease in the wood, the desperate scratch of a message left by someone who knew all too well what it meant to be watched. I loved once. Do not record this. It loops in your mind like a mantra, a rebellion, a plea. And it makes you wonder not just about who wrote it, but about how many others tried to carve their feelings between the lines of official record. How many dared to risk the only thing truly forbidden in a world of iron and parchment? Intimacy that couldn't be explained. Tonight, we go underground beneath the scrolls and permission slips, past the incense trails and poetic exchanges, into the veiled world of secret marriages and unapproved children. Because for all the precision and protocol, people still fell in love. People still broke rules. People still had children they weren't supposed to have. And some of those children quiet, brilliant, born in shadow changed history. We begin with the story of Lady Suma, a concubine never officially recorded in any daimyo ledger. She lived within the secondary residence of a minor warlord, known more for his poetry than his military might. No documentation exists of her arrival. No list includes her name. And yet, 3 generations later, her descendants controlled half the coastline trade. How? Because she bore a child in secret, hidden, protected, then slowly introduced to court life under a different name. By the time anyone noticed, the boy had allies, influence, and a brushstroke style that made his calligraphy unmistakable. His lineage was never challenged. Not because no one suspected, but because no one wanted to unearth the truth of how much the system had already failed to control desire. Such cases were rare, but not unheard of. The practice had a name, concubine, meaning shadow lineage. Children born to unrecorded parents, raised quietly by wet nurses or distant cousins, often brought into the family structure as wards or talented servants, before being legitimized through strategic marriages or battlefield valor. These children didn't just survive, they often thrived. Perhaps because they understood from birth that every step forward had to be earned in silence, and make no mistake, their parents paid a price. One samurai, caught fathering a child with a tea house girl during a provincial inspection tour, was given a choice: disown the child or forfeit his stipend. He refused. He left his post. The girl was never seen again, but the boy was raised by monks and later re-entered service under a new name. Ironically, he became the chief scribe for the same district where his father had once served. His first act in office? Burning all inspection tour records from that year. Whether for revenge or mercy, no one ever found out. There were also instances where love was hidden not for political reasons, but for spiritual ones. A monk and a noble woman, both sworn to celibacy, are said to have met every solstice beneath a waterfall shrine, where they performed a silent ritual of touch, no words, no commitments, no scrolls. When she died, the monk tattooed a single kanji still over his heart. He never spoke again. His temple said he'd taken a vow of silence. But his letters, found years later, told a different story. I remembered her with my skin, he wrote. I prayed with my hands. Some samurai chose another path: secret marriage. Illegal, unapproved, impossible to defend, but sometimes the only way to give a lover even the illusion of legitimacy. These unions were performed in private, often by retired monks or sympathetic shrine keepers. No documents, no witnesses. Just vows exchanged over incense and folded cloth. One such ritual, recorded in the journal of a traveling priest, involved a samurai placing his sword across his partner's lap, saying only, "You are the only thing I will not use it for." The ceremony was over in minutes. The bond? Eternal. Or so they hoped. Children from these marriages were more vulnerable. Without recognition, they couldn't inherit land or titles. But they inherited something else: the fire of their parents' defiance. Many became artists, monks, merchants, people who shaped culture from the margins. One famous ukiyo-e painter, known for his portraits of longing and vanishing figures, was later revealed to be the unacknowledged son of a daimyo and a dancer. His most haunting piece? A woman folding a kimono in an empty room. The caption reads, "No one saw her leave, but everything missed her." And then there were the ones who didn't hide, who loved out loud, who faced the consequences. A woman named Asio, promised to a warrior twice her age, refused on the day of her engagement. Instead, she ran away with her childhood companion, a servant's son. They lived in the hills, foraging, writing poems, raising goats. When they were finally found, Asio was offered a chance to return alone, forgiven, as though none of it had happened. She declined. She handed over her family, combed, kissed her lover in full view of the officials, and vanished into the forest. Decades later, travelers reported a pair of elderly figures living in a garden of wild chrysanthemums, offering tea and stories. When asked for their names, they replied, "We stopped answering to the ones that forgot us." Even in death, some lovers resisted forgetting. Graves hidden under trees instead of beside shrines. Shared urns with no labels. Hair interwoven into prayer ropes. One samurai left a will specifying that his ashes be divided half to the family temple, half to the woman who knew my footsteps. She was never named. But her descendants still light incense for the man with no records. All of this raises the question, what does it mean to be remembered? In a world obsessed with scrolls and stamps, Is it possible that love was safest when it left no trace? Or was the ultimate defiance not secrecy but memory? The ability to carry a person through time without needing anyone else to validate it? Tonight, as you sit with that question, you glance toward your own shelf at the ribbon you never returned, the cup with a faint lipstick rim, the brush that still smells faintly of jasmine. None of it's in the ledger, none of it was permitted, but it exists, it matters. And maybe that's enough, because long after scrolls crumble and ink fades, there will still be those who remember, not because they were told to, but because they chose to. The night is unusually quiet. Even the wind seems to have paused, as if the world itself is holding its breath. You sit alone now, not because the house's empty servants whisper, papers shuffle, the brazier pops softly with its steady breath, but because you've traveled too far inward to hear anything else. The paper crane, the shadow lineage, the perfume letters. Every tale has etched itself into your ribs like lacquer lines in old wood. And you realize, slowly, deeply, perhaps even reluctantly, that the thing most regulated, most permission-bound, most suppressed in this entire samurai world was not sex, it was softness. And in this final moment, we open the scroll on that last fragile truth. You were taught that strength meant silence, that tears were shameful, that yearning should be folded into formality, ironed flat beneath calligraphy. Lessons and sword drills. You were taught that a warrior dies before he weeps, but that was never quite true, was it? The record-keeping, the rituals, the incense, the endless poetry, all of it is proof of a culture desperate to touch without touching, to love without naming, to hold without being seen holding. Intimacy existed here. It just wore armor. And that armor, for all its beauty, was never meant to protect. It was meant to delay. You think now of all the names you were never allowed to say aloud. Of the face you saw only once across the incense fog. Of the lover who wasn't called a lover. Of the night you slept on the floor outside her door, scroll clutched in hand, never delivered. Not because you weren't brave, but because bravery had been redefined to mean restraint. You remember how your father once told you, duty before desire, and how your mother, folding his robe, quietly added, desire doesn't vanish. It just grows still. All around you, samurai have spent centuries refining stillness into something sacred. And yet, stillness is not absence. It's a kind of waiting, a loaded hush, a room that remembers. The stories you've heard, some half-whispered, others hidden between brushstrokes, weren't just erotic tales. They were maps, blueprints for a gentler rebellion. They prove that even in the most suffocating systems, softness blooms. Quietly, rebelliously, irreversibly. Take for instance the story of Taro and Ayaka. Not famous, not scandalous. Just two people who exchanged one poem a year, every spring, folded into the binding of an estate ledger. For 17 years. Never acknowledged, never consummated. But when Taro died, a servant found all 17 poems sewn into his bedding. And Ayaka, she stopped speaking. She spent her last days tending irises, her favorite flower, which Taro had once compared to her voice. One guest noted, she hummed to them, softly, but never aloud. Tell me that's not love. Tell me that's not the loudest softness ever. Recorded. Or the case of the wandering monk who painted the same face on 1,000 paper lanterns across different provinces. Each one slightly different, each one anonymous. When asked who she was, he said only, a prayer for someone who never asked. No one ever knew if she lived, or if she was real, or if she ever saw them. But the light stayed on, even the most hardened among us cracked. Lord Hizashi, renowned for his brutality in the northern campaigns, was said to keep a room no one entered, no decorations, no scrolls, just a robe, folded on a stand, not his, too small, too pale. Rumors swirled, of course. A lover? A child? A memory he couldn't bury? Hasashi never answered. But in his will, he requested only one thing, that the robe be buried in his place. He asked no one to attend his funeral. They found the robe already wrapped, pressed with dried wisteria, and embroidered inside the collar with a single line, "What the world would not allow, you let be." That was all. That was everything. Even those who lived entirely by the rules couldn't erase their softness. They just buried it deeper. A steward known for his strict oversight once confessed, near death, that he'd memorized every poem ever denied inclusion in the estate records, all 3,746 of them. He recited them to a junior scribe in his final days. The scribe wrote them down, secretly. He titled the collection, Unsaid. And you reading this, remembering this, you're part of that softness too. Every breath you've held, every glance you stole, every letter you burned because someone might find it. You've carried this world inside you without ever naming it. But you know it. You know the sensation of waiting for a knock that doesn't come. Of lighting incense not because it's tradition, but because it might remind someone of you. You know what it means to write someone's name once, just once, and then fold the paper 12 times before hiding it in a wall you'll never see again. In the end, what do you keep? Not the armor that rusts, not the scrolls. They crumble. What you keep is the rhythm of a voice you haven't heard in years, the scent of clove on your sleeve, the way their name felt on your tongue when you first whispered it into the sleeve of your own robe, afraid and alive. You keep the softness, and the softness keeps you. And maybe, just maybe, that's the point. That all this discipline, all this silence was never meant to kill feeling, only to contain it, to fold it down until it was small enough to carry without breaking. But feelings don't vanish. They persist. They ferment. They slip through paper and protocol. They write themselves into margins and dreams and untended corners of the garden. And when they finally return, when someone lights the right incense, or wears the right robe, or places a paper crane beside your bed, you remember. You remember. Everything. So now, as the last embers fade and the room softens into full night, you breathe out just a little deeper. You've journeyed through scrolls and silences, incense and ink, layered robes and layered emotions. The world of the samurai, once thought to be all blades and stone, has revealed itself to be something much quieter, much sadder, much more tender than the stories ever said aloud. Behind every permission slip was a plea. Behind every denied glance, a heartbeat. And in all that controlled longing, a whole landscape of hidden love bloomed, never loud, never claimed, but always there. You're tired now. But it's not the kind of tired you need to fix. It's the kind that lets you sink into stillness. The kind that invites memory, not sleep. That lets the weight of centuries settle gently into your bones. You can still smell the sandalwood. Still feel the rough edge of the scroll. Still picture the name you never said. The sleeve you never touched. The breath that lingered a second too long. So let it all go now. Let the past fade into mist, like a figure disappearing down a lantern-lit path. Let the softest parts of you unfold again, without fear, without code, without needing a seal of approval. You've earned your rest. Now, close your eyes, let the silence do the speaking, and drift into a place where even samurai are allowed to feel. End of script. Sweet dreams.